Let's start with roll call.
Commission members Baisley,
Excused.
Capelli,
Here.
Castriota,
Here.
Degree Kennedy,
Here.
Davis,
Here.
Jonas,
Here.
Doherty,
Here.
Rizal,
Here.
Berman,
Here.
Groff,
Excused.
Johnson,
Here.
Olney,
Here.
Hogue,
Here.
Richardson,
Here.
Van Rye, Terry,
Here.
Vic,
Here.
Kerr.
Here.
Mr. Chair.
Here. All right. We certainly have a quorum. I would expect we'll see Senator Baisley as well as we continue our work. We still are going on second reading in the Senate. There is a possibility that at least the senators might get called back for division votes or cow votes, that type of thing, committee of the whole votes. But definitely wanted to get us started as close to one as we could. A very warm welcome to Commissioner Van Rye, who's filling in today. Thanks for joining us. So glad to have you here from Alamosa County as we continue our discussions. Just a few opening remarks. I did send a few comments by email to the commission to kind of help us get rolling today. I do want to emphasize that as promised, a first draft of a bill was shared with everybody on the timeline that we discussed on April 12th. I do want to again emphasize this is a draft of a bill for our discussion today. There's no introduced legislation at this stage, working toward that goal, of course, to introduce something next week, but didn't want to take that step until we had a chance all to come back together and discuss different ideas for the bill and the draft that you all received. I really tried to work hard over the last month with my colleagues here in the legislature to take the recommendations that we all came up with and turn it into a first draft. I erred on the side of, well, let's see what this thing looks like. And so that's what you're getting in this draft. But obviously that was meant to help spur our discussion and say, yeah, we like that overall concept, but maybe we want to make an adjustment to that section, or, hey, I don't think that section is ready yet. That is, of course, all very appropriate for today's discussion. So it's great to have all this expertise back in the room as we continue to work hard on this. And provide not only an improved property tax system for the state of Colorado, but to craft some additional tax relief for our constituents and our different parts of the state. So with that, let me turn it over to the vice chair, see if Commissioner Kerr has any opening remarks.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and just welcome to everyone, and excited to be getting into the meat of what our commission was appointed to do. And I will try not to pull the old, well, you know, when I worked here type of stuff, but I do want to let folks know that, yes, time is nigh here in the legislative session, and things can feel pretty pressed. But one thing I do know is that the veteran legislators down here, and especially the staff, the folks that work in this building, are used to this. This is what they do every year, and when it comes to the end of the session. And these folks are professionals. They work great under pressure. I know they're kind of looking at me side eye right now, but they work great under pressure. And I don't want us to be concerned that, you know, we knew what the timeline was coming in. Let's get to work. Let's get some ideas out on the table, and let's get this done. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. As far as our printed agenda today, I think we're going to make a little adjustment because the title board continues its work as we speak. We think we're going to have significant additional information by about 4 o'clock today. And so what I'd like to suggest is that we move our update on ballot initiatives to the end of our agenda, but make sure that no later than 4:30, we turn to that topic, because I want to make sure we have at least 30 minutes for that part of our statutory remit. The idea there, as you'll remember from our last meeting, is that we had remaining ballot initiatives that we didn't consider because they were still at title board. We should have most of, if not all of that information by 4:30 today. And that would give us a chance to finish any consideration of remaining ballot initiatives after their process at the title board has been complete, which of course today is the last day for that. So without objection, I think what we'll do is go ahead and move that part to the end of our meeting, and again have a hard stop on our other discussions by 4:30, because I don't want to keep anybody past 5 here, as has been our practice over the several months that we've been together. But before we make that decision, I just want to check, see if everybody's all right with that adjustment. All right, seeing no objection, then we'll move consideration of ballot initiatives and get to hear from Mr. Sabetsky and his team on that topic toward the end of our meeting. Again, no later than 4:30, depending on how our next discussion goes. All right, well, that brings us then to the chance to dive into the legislative draft that you all received. My hope today is to be able to go through in a fairly methodical way, matching up to our recommendations. So a recommendation translates into a section or multiple sections in the bill, have a chance to just take those in order, and along the way be able to hear from the fiscal staff. I'd asked them to prepare several pieces of kind of opening information for us on the fiscal impact of some parts of the proposal. I will say that there has not been adequate time to do an entire fiscal note, but I thought that having that information to set up our discussions would be really useful to kick things off. And of course, this is going to be changed, and so it wouldn't be a great use of time to do a full fiscal note on a first draft anyway. So with that, I wonder if we can invite up Mr. Sabetsky, Mr. Hansen to share with us some of the initial estimates that they've prepared, and I'll let them get settled in, and we can take a look at that information to help set up our larger discussion on the proposal. Welcome, Mr. Hansen. It was Bring Your Child to Work Day yesterday, and I got to meet Mr. Hansen's adorable, was he 9-year-old son? 10, fantastic. Yeah, they don't stay adorable for much longer. Just a pro tip for you there. All right. And while David's getting set up, just a huge thank you to Pierce Lively, to Greg Sabetsky, his entire team, Mr. Hansen, of course, a tremendous amount of thought, effort, modeling, drafting that has gone into this so far, and we're so grateful for that. And ladies and gentlemen, we are joined by Commissioner Joanne Groff. It's great to have you here, Joanne. All right. And we do now have ice water available. Everyone stay hydrated. It could be a long afternoon. Thank you to our sergeants. Keeping us safe and hydrated at the same time. Just a few other just quick remarks as we're waiting for Mr. Hansen to get set up. We're going to be taking a look at sort of fiscal impact of sort of the biggest pieces of the proposal that came out of our recommendations. So things like what would be the impact of smoothing? What would be the impact of continuation of the 23 treatment into 24? So just asked the team to prepare a few of those to give us an estimate of where we think those are as far as cost, fiscal implications, backfill implications, which I think will really help inform our discussions this afternoon. So, Mr. Hansen, over to you.
All right, thank you. For the record, David Hansen, Legislative Council staff. And so this bill draft has a number of pieces. And so this presentation will look at some of the bigger pieces of this bill draft and the impact of it, particularly changes to assessed value through either assessment rate reductions, value subtractions, or smoothing before we get to the assessment rate. All right, so excuse me here. Just starting with the residential actual value adjustments, and just going over what the bill draft has in it and what I modeled here. So we're looking at an actual value subtraction. Rather than the 55,000 that we have for the 2023 property tax year, this would be up to 10% of actual value, up to $75,000. That would be a subtraction from the value, and then an assessment rate would be applied. This, in the bill draft, it applies to all residential and property tax year 2024. And in property tax year 2025 and later years, it just applies to owner-occupied primary residences. And the bill draft sets up a whole process for identifying these owner-occupied primary residences. Just looking at this piece of it, we're looking just in our forecast period through property tax year 2026. And we're looking at a decrease in local property tax revenue, and a preliminary number, let me just throw that out there, of about $520 million for property tax year 2024. And again, this is on all residential, so all single family and multifamily parcels. But then it's only owner occupied in property tax year 2025, so it's a smaller amount in property tax year 2025. And then that persists into 2026 on that owner occupied level. The state school finance obligation then would increase by about 180 million for the 2024 property tax year, and then decrease to about 145 million in the out years. Going into what the bill draft does to commercial assessment rates, it has a step down in the assessment rate for improved commercial over multiple years. This starts in the property tax year 2025 when it drops to 27.5% from 29%, and then has half percentage point decreases through 2029. Just isolating the impacts to this assessment rate reduction, we're looking at about $161 million local property tax revenue impact for the property tax year 2025. But that compares to current law, and because it continues to step down, that increases to $216.5 million in property tax year 2026. And with each half percentage point step down, I would expect maybe a similar amount, 60 million or so each in revenue impact for each step down in that assessment rate. That's the state school finance obligation then would increase by about 56.2 million in 2025, and then in 2027 going up to 77 million. So in the bill, there's residential and non-residential property tax smoothing, and I modeled this beginning in property tax year 2027. Basing the assessed value would be first based on the smoothed actual value over these 3 assessment cycles, and then in the bill draft, then you would get your value reductions and your assessment rate applied to that. But this just takes a look at the smoothing in isolation here for this presentation. In addition to residential, smoothing would occur for vacant property, commercial, industrial, and natural resource property classes. And basically our annually assessed property types, personal property, oil and gas, producing mines, would not be included in this smoothing, and neither would agricultural. Just taking a look and breaking it down between residential and non-residential impacts for these smoothing, we're looking at about 634 million in local property tax revenue impact. This is based on 8.6% growth rate of residential for the 2027 property tax year, and about 4.7% in non-residential that I modeled out. And I basically took a reference year during the last economic expansion and applied it to 2027. This could vary significantly depending on economic circumstances. And so if it was, 1% increase or something like that, like still very slow growth over this period, this would be a vastly different impact. And then with smoothing, if let's say, for instance, in our next reassessment cycle in property tax year 2029, if we had a lower amount of growth in 2029, then this gap would shrink because of the smoothing. And so this does, I think, hopefully this demonstrates what it would look like in this first year. But again, just recognizing that there could be a lot of variability, and smoothing works to stabilize values both ways. It'll be lower if there's a rapid increase in values, and it'll be higher if there's either a decrease or a lower amount of growth. So the bill draft has some set aside for local government reimbursements, and the current bill draft, the calculation is based on reducing the general fund reserve by 2/3 of 1% of appropriations. Under current law, the reserve is 15% of appropriations. And so based on the most recent data available, this equates to about 105 million in fiscal year 2024-25. And with that, I'll wrap up my portion of the presentation and open it up for any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Hansen. Before we let you go, I wanted to see if we might be able to also get in front of the commission the estimate around continuation. So I don't know if that's you or Mr. Sabetsky, but the other request that we had was to see if we could understand the fiscal impact of extending PTY 23 into PTY 24. What would that look like from a fiscal standpoint? So I wonder if we could add that on to your remarks here.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And yes, I did model this, but do not have a slide put together yet. But what I modeled was about continuing. So we're looking at several different changes. A 6.7% residential assessment rate, a $55,000 actual value adjustment to all residential parcels. And then we're also looking at a 27.9% non-residential assessment rate for most classes, and a $15,000 actual value reduction for improved commercial. And I modeled about a $1.1 billion local revenue impact, and then about a $380 million increase in the school finance obligation for extending that into the 2024 property tax year.
All right. So, Mr. Hansen, just to clarify, and then I'll turn to the commission for questions on all the material you've just shared with us, just to make sure I heard that last part. I think that's the key figure here. So extending all of our current measures for another year would result in a $1.1 billion change on local district revenue and an increase in state share of K-12 by 380
million. Yeah,
just want to make sure I got that 100% clear. All right. Let me open it up for questions on this important information. Let's start with Commissioner Terry.
Thank you very much. Okay, quick question. The impact, the $1.1 billion impact does not include the school, the state's obligation to backfill the schools, right?
So that is under all levies. So it does include those total program levies all added together. Total programs, special districts. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So that is the impact, but what if you applied the backfill amounts that are set out in 238? Would that then lower that number? Because I'm looking at what the reimbursement amounts were for 238 and 001, and they're substantially less than 1.1 billion. So help me understand what those differences or how that would work.
Yeah, 238 backfill, we did around 240 million. And then there was an additional 54 million that was slated for local governments in Senate Bill 1. I did not model what exactly backfill would look like by extending all of this to property tax year 2024, what that would mean in terms of, the exact, so, I mean, are we looking at Senate Bill 1 formula or a 238 formula? Differed in how they treated reimbursing local governments. And so, yeah, I do not have a good, the amount that was slated for reimbursement in those.
So what if, what if you just, we take 001 out of that conversation equation and just looked at the backfill amount from 238, because if 238 was extended, but RAR is going to go down a tad, is that right? Or would it stay the same for 2024 under 238? Did that make sense?
I think so. Are you referencing the adjustment to the other residential except multifamily assessment rate
Yes,
to achieve the $700 million reduction over 2 years?
yes.
So yeah, my modeling did compare the current loss scenario to extending the 2023 assessment rates and value reductions. So it was based on a 7.06% other residential rate that's except multifamily and a 6.8% multifamily rate.
Thank you. That helps.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Zbesky, please add on. And of course, we can absolutely dialogue at this point. This is not a formal hearing.
So, yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. For the record, Greg Sebetsky, Chief Economist, Legislative Council staff. The reason I wanted to come to the table and speak to Commissioner Terry's question and questions that we've gotten throughout the day on this backfill component, I'm sure the commissioners are aware, but I want to go back and jog your memories concerning how the backfill parameters worked in the 2022 legislation, Senate Bill 238, and the special session legislation, Senate Bill 1. Both of those backfill calculations were sensitive to the amount of assessed value growth that was realized in a district on a year-over-year basis. And so districts that saw sufficiently large assessed value growth received less backfill, or in some cases, no backfill. Districts that saw less assessed value growth received additional backfill. That made sense in the context of the 2023 property tax year. This was a reassessment year. In the overwhelming majority of districts across the state, we saw significant year-over-year increases in assessed valuations. In most of those districts, that was still true even after accounting for the property tax reductions that were attributable to the legislation that we're talking about. In the case of the simulation that that the chair asked Mr. Hansen to put together that he just presented for you a moment ago, we would be extending the tax cuts that have been installed for 2023 into 2024. 2024 is an intervening year. The only reason why under current law we expect there to be an increase in assessed value in most districts in 2024 is because the tax cuts that apply for 2023 are going away. In this simulation, they wouldn't be going away. They would continue to apply for 2024. And so now the formula to determine the backfill doesn't work like it did in 2023. It works by saying, well, the vast majority of districts saw no or a very insignificant amount of AV growth year on year from 2023 to 2024. If you apply that same backfill formula, you'll effectively be backfilling all property tax losses in most districts, and in certain large counties, you'll only be backfilling 65% of losses because that's how the formula worked. But I don't think that, in my opinion, speaking to the commission as people who are supposed to be wrapping their heads around this question, I don't think that the backfill formula that was established for 2023 really makes sense in the context of the property tax picture for 2024. And so when confronted with this question earlier today, we sort of said, we're not sure that formula applies correctly in this case, and we didn't run those numbers.
That makes sense, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, please continue. And then I'm going to come to Commissioner Groff. I think I saw your hand next.
Thanks. Thank you very much. That makes sense, and now I understand what you mean.
Commissioner Groff.
So, quick question. The formula, the amounts of money that we're discussing for 238, and we're very familiar with those at the Division of Property Taxation. Thank you for your help. Those would also be modified they would be reduced, even if we did the 55, with 27, if we take the residential assessment rate for all others up to 7.06, it would be significantly less, would it not? So when we look to what we would do as a backfill, as a committee, we kind of want to piece and part out. This portion of it, that portion of it, we can't necessarily calculate it until we know all the portions, but we need to recognize that a 7.06 residential assessment rate as opposed to a 6.7% residential assessment rate would make a significantly more money. Even if we held everything else the same, it would mean significantly more money going to districts and going to taxing jurisdictions. That was number one. And I'm seeing, for those of you that are listening, heads are nodding. But the second issue is in those numbers, the 238 numbers and the 001 numbers, we are not accounting for school districts. So you did have backfill to school districts, but that ended up coming because of the formula, not because of a specific backfill mechanism.
Mr. Hansen.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, and welcome Senator Baisley. Make sure we get you added to the roll. Commissioner Terry, please continue.
Thank you. Another question for this very brilliant staff. How much was the growth, do we think, in 2024, 2023? Because it was so much higher in 2022.
Mr. Hansen, you're asking about the AV growth?
Yes, I'm sorry, the AV growth
Are you talking about current law or under what I modeled?
under current law.
So under current law, we modeled across all classes, I think 6.9% assessed.
She's asking for 2023.
Oh, yeah. So what was the growth from 2022 to 2023 in assessed value? I think it was about 24.5, 24.6%. I see a nod to my right here in the AV growth in that year. And does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Hansen, or I don't know if you want to rewind on your slides. Oh, yes, Rep. Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hansen, I was really interested to see the numbers that you put together with respect to the non-residential rate decreases. Were any prospective increases in non-residential values introduced into that model, or were the values just held constant?
Mr. Hansen.
Yes. So this was based on our assessed value model, which does account for some low growth. I'm off the top of my head, maybe between 1% or 2% or something like that in each of these property tax years for improved commercial. And so there is some actual value growth built into the model that these are based on.
All right, is that clear for everybody? How is organic growth assumption or value growth assumption? Yeah, let's come down here. Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify just a little bit further, on all of these, the reductions are actually reductions in the increase of revenues, correct?
Mr. Hansen.
Yes. So even with just the changes to residential and commercial assessment rates through our forecast period, it still allows for some growth in AV. It's not going negative in our model. And so it is yes, it is would be a lower rate of growth.
So just in plain English, we're still increasing in the revenues, but we're increasing by less with these.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the idea here was, between current law and if we extended, right? We're trying to, obviously there's lots of things happening organically in the market value change, et cetera. But I was trying to at least give us the numbers so we understood A versus B, in this case, current law versus extension, or the proposals that we're talking about today. Yep, thanks. All right, other clarification questions or other questions for our incredible economic team? Yes, Representative Degree Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hansen, the numbers you modeled out for smoothing, I assume those are in addition to the other reductions in the both the non-res and the res prop tax reductions?
Yeah,
Mr.
thank you. Thank you for the question. So it would be in addition, but I don't think, because I modeled it independently, can be added exactly to these other figures. Because residential is isolated to just residential and these commercial assessment rate reductions are isolated to that property class, those are additive, but the smoothing is not additive in these slides. But I think if you added it, you'd probably be getting close to what it would be, but not exact.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Commissioner Vick.
Just very briefly, can we get kind of a running total on these as they interplay with each other together? Instead of seeing like individual numbers for each, just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I appreciate that suggestion. Yeah, and I can send out a slide or add a slide that adds these totals together.
Yeah. Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, my first question was the same as Representative Degree Kennedy, so thank you for that. But Mr. Hansen, you said that on the backfill component, the reserve fund, as the calculation is in the legislation, would amount to about $100 million. Is that correct? Based on 2024?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It has the bill draft lays out amounts for backfill, and it mirrors Senate Bill 1 at this point. But it also, it basically pegs that to lowering the reserve, general fund reserve, and pegging it to a certain 2/3% of that general fund appropriation. That amount is $105 million. And so I think that at least things would get proportionally reduced to meet that $105 million in the bill draft as it exists now.
So in the bill draft as it exists now, that fund would yield, you're saying, about $105 million? Is that accurate, or
Yeah.
am I? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, and I understand this is just a draft, but if the draft stays as is, that would be all the backfill that would be available for the projected amounts of revenue lost through the years, correct?
That is correct. And that is for, let me specify, since Ms. Graff pointed it out, but for local government entities excluding school districts.
Correct. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Other questions? Seeing anything else online? Anything else for the team at this point? Mr. Sabetsky.
So a couple things to add really quickly. Mr. Lively, who has drafted the draft legislation that you all have seen, just came to catch me and make sure that we clarified for the record. The $105 million is our estimate of 2/3 of 1 percentage point of general fund appropriations for FY 24-25. Importantly, the bill draft as written makes that contribution in multiple years because it obligates 2/3 of 1 percentage point in 24-25, and then similar percentages of appropriations in subsequent fiscal years, such that the aggregate amount that would be made available for backfill would sum up across those multiple years as opposed to occurring only once. Obviously, when you're spending money out of the reserve doesn't automatically refill, but the bill is written in such a way that it would make those funds available in subsequent years as well over a 3-year period. The other point that I wanted to raise, Mr. Chair, for the purposes of our conversation today, we've done, as you've seen, some scoring on the bill draft that the chair circulated to members of the commission. And in response to Commissioner Vick's question, we do have that in our documents where we've rolled it up into one place. This isn't a complete score for the bill draft as you've seen it, for a couple of reasons. One, there's a whole bunch of additional work to figure out implementation costs that we haven't done. 2, this is, a work in progress. 3, we understand that the bill draft itself is a work in progress. And so these numbers are intended to be illustrative. They're not supposed to be a final picture of how we might even score that bill if it was introduced as is. I'll also note one thing that Mr. Hansen pointed out is our smoothing assumptions don't match exactly what's in the bill draft. We said smoothing starting in 2027. In the bill draft that you all saw, the smoothing starts in the 2025 reassessment. We understand that that's not the sponsor's intent. So that's one important caveat. The other caveat is Mr. Hansen did, I think, a very admirable job of trying to give you all a sense of the numbers for what happens if you extend the 2023 property tax provisions forward into 2024. And I think we're all on the same page, but because the subject matter is so dense, I just wanted to make sure that you understood when we presented those numbers, we included the incremental cost of reducing assessment rates that would otherwise be applied under current law to the levels that are in place for 2023. And Commissioner Groff asked this question, which is, well, if we actually just held the assessment rates as they are scheduled to be set for the 2024 year, wouldn't that reduce the estimate that Mr. Hansen presented? And that is correct, it would. So depending on which elements of the 2023 property tax regime you want to have applicable in 2024, you're going to get different pieces of that. We'll work on attempting to break out, those elements. In response to a question from Commissioner Degree Kennedy, Mr. Hansen pointed out these things can't be segmented in exactly that way. They are to some extent interactive. And so it's not as if each individual part of these property tax proposals is modular and can be stacked together to build an impact. To some extent, these things are going to have impacts on one another. And so we'll continue to work on that as legislation, is introduced later in the session, if that's something that happens. Obviously, for the ballot measures as well. I think a lot of that is review, but since this is as dense as it is, and this commission is as big as it is, and some of us are in the room and some of us are online, and some of us live and breathe this stuff every day, and some of us have bigger jobs with other responsibilities as well. I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page and let you know that we're able to clarify anything further over the course of this meeting if it's helpful for you all.
All right, Commissioner Richardson.
Just one, and I believe I know the answer, but as you do your analysis, I know it's everything else is pretty much held static. There's no analysis of the potential positive economic impacts to the state of leaving $1.1 billion in the hands of the people to spend or invest.
Mr. Spetsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Richardson. That's a great question. It's one that we wrestle with often. As an economist, I would tell you, of course, you're going to have downstream economic effects by leaving $1.1 billion in household balances, business balances in the private sector for reinvestment. There are also economic knock-on effects associated with not having that money available to local governments to invest in services or to give back to taxpayers and TABOR refunds. So there are those offsetting impacts. It's difficult to identify the specific marginal effects. As a matter of office policy, we don't feel that we can credibly capture those, and so we don't.
Oh, understood, but thank you.
Yep.
All right, right here in front, Commissioner Johnson.
Happy Friday. Have you envisioned for whatever this number ends up being, 380-ish million, et cetera, the sources of funding that would potentially cover that? Would it be exclusive, for example, on the school finance obligation to state ed fund? Would there be other sources envisioned to offset this if it were passed en masse?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that one because I think we kind of set it up earlier with the estimate that I had requested, which is if we decide legislatively to move forward with a backfill mechanism that partially or fully relies on reserves, okay, how much do you eat into reserves? And so we, at least now we've got a good estimate, which is for every 0.2%, it's $105 million of available backfill out of reserves. But to your very good question, Commissioner Johnson, that leaves open the option of, okay, is that the right percent? Do we do more? Do we do less? Do we instead mix that with other sources like a draw on state education fund for K-12 backfill? So there's a number of different options there. I just want to make sure that we had for today the ability to understand the magnitude of the backfill requirement. So that was the first set of estimates. And then as we think about backfill options that are relatively limited because there's no general fund laying around like there was last time, what would that mean on the reserves? And so now we've got that estimate from the economic team. All right. Well, thank you both, of course. And I have a feeling as we continue this, may have some more questions for you as we go. And the what ifs that I have no doubt will be part of our vibrant discussion this afternoon. All right. Well, with that, I would like to move into a broader discussion of the, oh, and I've just gotten a note that the title board is done. So that bodes very well for us to have a complete discussion before we wrap up our gathering here today. So that's great. We'll give Mr. Savetsky time to digest whatever just happened. All right. Well, I'll be today wanted to next move into a discussion of the bill draft. As I said, we did a best job that we could to take the recommendations that came out of this commission and turn them into draft legislation. And what I'd like to do is kind of go through them in the order that you find them in the bill summary. I think that's probably the easiest way to structure our conversations today. We can obviously turn to the actual language if needed, but the bill summary gives us a pretty good roadmap today. And so I think with that in mind, we start with at the really the bottom of page 1 of the draft. You see the summary there with local government property tax revenue limit. And so I think what we'll do is we'll just take these kind of topic by topic. I would love to hear kind of like what we did before with Keystone's help. You know, what do you think works here? What do you think needs adjustment? What do you think maybe needs more time for evaluation? But would like to just kind of methodically work through these, take a lot of notes together. And of course, the idea is that we take the summary of this meeting and use that to help us craft the next draft. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into the first part of the bill. Yeah, Mr. Vice Chair.
Great, thank you. I just want to let you and folks know one of the lenses I'm going to be looking through this as we go through this process you just outlined. And you and I have chatted about this a little bit, and I think it fits right in with what you said at the beginning of the session when you mentioned that this is a draft, and you've put a lot of sections and a lot of information in here, knowing that there are things that we'll probably want to trim down or take out. Just one of the lenses I want you to know that I'm going to be looking at is that some of the ideas in here, I think we've had good, robust conversation, general agreement about, but I don't, in my opinion, are not quite ready to be on bill paper right now, and that I might be kind of putting them. These might be ideas that we should still be talking about, but maybe push off a little bit. So just wanted to let you know that some of those things, and I'm going to be kind of keeping a list for myself of which things I put there and which I think we should definitely be focused on now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of our gathering today, is kind of getting to some consensus or some feedback on exactly that question. And I would say we did collectively vote to extend our service into the interim. So I have no doubt there'll be some topics today where we say, yep, that's still interesting, but we're going to need to chew on it some more over the interim. So that is a perfectly rational outcome from our discussion. All right, so let's, I'll be asking for Keystone's help along the way here to keep us on track. But let's look at the first section here together, and then we'll kind of move through them in order. Love to hear thoughts on what you think is working, what maybe needs more attention, and maybe what we should push to June.
Yeah,
go ahead, Trace.
I was just going to say, I think it'll be helpful too, just to hear, like, let's just stick with that first question first, so that we're not kind of, going all over the place. So with this first section, what's working for you? What do you want to call out? What do you love? What do you want to ensure would be kept?
Jump in.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the boundaries you're attempting to set, but I think unfortunately these all interact with each other. So I don't think we're going to be able to stick to that. But I appreciate the spirit of it. I think
so. B for effort, they call that.
I mean, it's understandable, but these things they do all intersect, and it's really kind of the combination of things that go into this bill that ultimately will make up the outcome. So I guess my thought on this is that, I don't have anything about this concept that I find offensive by itself, but I think given what we've been grappling with here, I think that what I wonder is what value does it add on top of all the other stuff in the bill? You know, right now I think these soft cap concepts are fine. But I don't know what it really does either for policy or for our kind of political challenges with these other ballot measures we're facing in conjunction with everything else. So I don't mean for that to be too sharp of a criticism. I think that there's something to it, and it does prompt a conversation to happen at the local government level where, you know, after a public hearing, after vetting these issues with the community, that there is an opportunity for the board to decide whether to adhere to these statewide limitations versus override them. So there's value, but I have questions about it, the interaction with the bigger picture.
Commissioner Terry.
Commissioner Terry.
Thank you very much. Senator Hansen, you've done noble work in getting everything down into a draft, and that's not easy to do, and we appreciate that very much. I'm wondering if anybody'd be willing to, rather than do a walkthrough of the bill, entertain somewhat of a substitute concept that includes some of the items that are in the bill, as well as then a discussion about what is in the bill that would also work with that in terms of having a 6% annual cap with conditions and keeping the commercial ratchet down, bond language, in other words, previous bond elections would not be affected. And then looking at the decoupling of schools as a study, but not including the school districts in the 6% annual growth cap. I think if we shift our focus just a little bit, we will also be able to look at some of the items within your bill draft. But for example, the homestead exemption, while that is extremely attractive and people will love that concept, it is something that is extremely expensive and just adds to additional cuts in the local government world. And recognizing the fact that the state can't continue to backfill and that can't be a long-term solution. We understand that. And actually, it shouldn't be your business to backfill it. We should get you guys out of the business of state property tax and put something in place that can stop these ongoing battles and wars that we have around property tax and give some tax relief by not, and at the same time, not discounting and harming the services that the taxpayers want in their local districts, in their schools, and in their counties. Does that sound approachable at all to anybody?
So Commissioner Terry, are you asking if we look at the package that you've assembled as a package? Is that what you're asking for?
I'm asking if we could look at the concept before we do a walkthrough of the 80-some pages, only because it may circumvent some of the conversation and we might be able to move forward and get some good dialogue and direction. But I'd adhere to my fellow commissioners and yourself.
I hope I've demonstrated throughout the 5 months that I'm happy to look at any idea at any time. And I think we've done a good job of that together. I'm very happy if you want to, lay out kind of the reconfiguration that I know you were taking elements that are on paper and some new ones that aren't. And if you'd like to have us look at that as a whole, I'm happy to entertain that. Yeah, and Mr. Fagan.
I was going to add to that, maybe perhaps in discussing like what the whole package is and how that differs from what the bill is, like what the significant differences are. For example, would you carry forward the primary residence exemption, and just like what are the major differences so people could see the alternatives?
Yeah, sure. And like with most things that happen in our public policy world, we start to have these aha moments very close to the deadlines. So this concept, and I think my fellow commissioner, Ms. Furman, is going to walk through it just a little bit, because it gives a good combination of tax relief, stability, and probably sends a message that we still care very deeply about our local government services and our non-res communities. But in addition to that, I think that it's something we've kind of floated conceptually in the last 24 hours. Again, my apologies for that coming so quickly, but it was just one of those aha moments. And so I will defer to some of the other commissioners I know that have been part of these conversations. Lastly, many of the local governments were part of this very last minute conversation yesterday when we were trying to figure out how do we stop having to come back every single year with some band-aid approach that then says that the state has to use reserves or TABOR reserves to backfill. So can we just do that for one more year and then put something in place?
Can we, so Lauren, are you going to go through each of these elements? Is that what I just heard? Man, because what I'm thinking might be helpful is that if there's this package, I think what Rennie was saying too is go through each of those just so people have like a high level of like what's in there, what's not, and then we can go back and go one by one and have a discussion.
Yeah, that sounds great. do we have anything we can share in writing? Just so people can look at it as we're talking about it. Even just bullet point type of list would be really valuable. And I know our staff can get it emailed to all of us so we can just look at it as we go.
I'll do some slides along the way of the concepts. How about that?
Yeah, even better. Yeah.
Okay.
Just throw them up on the screen in real time.
Yep.
Yeah, it's great. All right, Commissioner Furman, let's go through the elements and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, commissioners. So I'm going to run through very similar to what Commissioner Terry ran through already. I think the biggest difference in what is in the draft legislative proposal and what is on this list is a 6% hard cap on annual growth each year that would apply to taxing jurisdictions, but excludes mills that are dedicated to debt service or any other general revenue exclusions, as well as exclusion of school districts. I'm looking at my fellow commissioner over here, Brett Johnson, to make sure I understood that. The next piece is potentially removing the smoothing provision, because I think there is a bit of angst around that language and the truth in taxation language in the draft proposal, or at least adjusting the smoothing provision. So we'll need to come up with what that could look like if we do want to adjust that language. But I think that's creating quite a bit of concern from some commissioners because they're not quite ready to adapt to that language yet. In terms of the decoupling, we've talked a lot about this, and the draft includes an immediate decoupling
Commissioner Furman,
provision.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to see if Trace, if we're able to see what you're compiling on the screen as we go. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, host. Yeah.
That would just help us keep up with the different points that you're putting forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, give us 1 second. We'll get that going, and that'll help our folks online as well.
We're on 3. I'll go back. Okay. Start
We're
with
on
number
decoupling.
Decoupling.
Great. So I think there's also some concern about moving into an immediate decoupling process. So one of the suggestions is potentially we stick with maybe the first year of some kind of study or analysis of the decoupling and then move into implementation in 2 years, just to give folks time to adjust to that decoupling idea. The next piece, we've talked a lot about this already, but some kind of extension of the residential reduction for the upcoming tax year. And certainly we need to understand what the actual backfill will look like. So I don't think we need to exhaust that much further than what we've already talked about there. Ensuring that we're keeping the commercial ratchet down language. And I think Commissioner Groff proposed a great idea, which gets us over a 5-year period down to the 25.5%. And I'm sure she can remind us of what that looked like again. And I think that was corrected in the most recent draft of the bill. And then including the bond language that we talked about in our last commission meeting, including the taxpayer deferral and the monthly payment provisions. We did get a letter, all of us got a letter from the state treasurer, so I think we're going to have to talk a little bit more about some of the concerns he's raised. I believe he might need some more time for the monthly payment provision. But I certainly think that's something that we could work through. That's the list. So I just don't see much variation there from what is in the draft bill with some exceptions, and just really the cap, I think, would be the biggest difference. And the concerns around the homestead exemption.
Commissioner Groff.
Can we
I just want to make sure we
round yet?
have it up on the screen so we can all see it. I guess what I was hearing on the relief side is it would be an extension on the res from 23 into 24, which we do have a impact estimate of, and then keeping the current proposal or similar proposal to the ratchet down on non-res, if I heard you correctly. Deferral and 12-month ideas, we'd like to see if we can make those work. But I just want to make sure we can all see them on the screen in some way. And we'll go Commissioner Groff and then over to Mayor Castriota.
So based on the order of presentation, I'm already asking for an amendment. But I don't have a problem with the 6% hard cap if that's okay with all of the taxing jurisdictions that are at the table, except that I would like to see an inflation provision. We usually do not have as dramatic inflation as we did last year, but a hard 6% cap may not account for inflation. So what I'd like to see is a 6% cap or inflation, and we can pick whatever inflation indicacy we want, whichever is more, so that it gives some recognition that the economy isn't always up for a 6% only adjustment.
All right, I'll go to Commissioner Terry for a response and then to the other folks who had their hands up.
Thank you. Commissioner Groff, great question. In the sense of the cap, it's a cap with some conditions. And we were looking at, obviously, this would apply to general fund, not debted, committed funds,
right.
committed mills, and any sort of prior election process that a district or a local government had gone through from floating mill levies, but also a piece of it that would naturally, as it normally does, apply to any sort of growth or inflation plus, I believe, population, I think if it's population and inflation, so that it would have a little bit more of a local flavor or flavor reflecting the economy at the time. So it wouldn't just be that hard cap in that sense. So I think that's an important piece. We also talked about a base year, looking at the 2024 year with the backfill as a base year going forward. Then also providing some sort of mechanism in the event that we have a horrible downturn or we experience downturn, so that it doesn't have that same effect, TABOR and ratcheted down effect. So those are a lot of devils to put, or details to give to the devil. But thank goodness we have some really smart tax people that can kind of figure some of those pieces out. I hope that helped.
Commissioner Groff.
I'm just going to go through these fast, and then I promise I'll be more quiet. But on the elimination of the smoothing, I love that, because the smoothing that's in there, I don't think will work for the assessors. We had talked in the committee about just smoothing over a 1 year or over one reassessment cycle. So so I'm good with all of that until I get to extension of residential reduction for 2024. Are you not thinking that we would extend the commercial reduction then?
Would like to respond to that. Commissioner Furman?
Thank you, Chairman. I guess what I was thinking is that we would
So
kick in the
238,
ratchet.
yeah, 238 had reductions for both residential and
Right.
commercial. 001 expanded the residential. So for the tax year for the 2023 tax year, collectible in 2024, all of those were accumulated with different backfill provisions. So I'm just looking, we could do, as we look to tweak, we could do just residential. I was just thinking that perhaps you were forgetting the $30,000 adjustment that we did for commercial.
From what I remember, thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, please go ahead.
From what I remember, what you had proposed, Commissioner, was a 26.8%.
Oh, different. So on the value adjustment after the establishment of the actual value, there was a value adjustment in 2023 for improved commercial properties of $30,000. For residential properties, the accumulation between the two bills, it was $55,000. I'm wondering if you're still wanting that, because you only mentioned the residential reduction, if you were thinking that we should not do the $30,000 commercial reduction. And I only bring it up because it's going to make a difference on the cost of backfill and the cost of modeling. So I'm not really having an opinion one way or the other. I'm just asking if you had included that in your thoughts.
Had not, but I would encourage a reduction on the commercial side and continuing.
So really
reduction if possible.
continuing what ultimately was the result of the adjustments of 2023 in some way.
And then implement that ratchet down concept
Right.
that you raised.
I think we
Getting
didn't start
down
the
to-
ratchet down concept though until 2025 reassessment year.
2026 was.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
but next reassessment.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Castriota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do have to just make a general comment about the process, because I know we were presented with a lot of different ideas over the last few months, and we moved them forward in, at least to me, for further study. So now that I'm seeing them in bill draft form, I still go back to these ideas were not vetted for unintended consequences. And I think we need to really be a little bit more thoughtful when we're talking about tax policy. There was a hasty study done last night at 7 p.m. by Colorado Counties, Inc. to see where people land on these different taxing schemes. And the majority of them said it needs further study. So I'm going to go with that on the decoupling of schools, the smoothing assessments, the 12 monthly payments, the primary homestead exemption. All of this really needs to be vetted along with the hard caps, because I don't know where the 6% came from, but no one checked with our county out if that's something that would accommodate. I also saw something about the floating mill levies come back up to lift the lid if it gets ratcheted down too far. And we've already had the discussion that requires voter approval. Float means that the mill levy will need to go up and down. In order for it to go up, that triggers a TABOR question. So it's not an automatic. We can't just lift the lid. We have to get voter approval for any type of mill levy float. And I've tried this before in my county, just a mill levy freeze, and it failed miserably. So it's not a given, and it's so with that, I don't know if anybody's unofficial study.
No, this, Commissioner Hansen, I think that would be fantastic to see that study.
Well, it's not really a study. It was
Or-
a hasty.
Okay, thank you. In terms of mill levy floats, those districts and local governments that have already had those elections where you can, we called them degallegalization for years, still honored. You're absolutely right, because that would disregard prior voter approval in a local government election. And to me, that's somewhat disrespectful to those voters and to what that district or county or city had already decided. So I think you bring up a good point there. And I'm not sure that I emphasized that the inclusion of any prior election was so important. But yes, love to see this survey. Thank you.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank
Then
you.
I'll go to Commissioner Pogue, who's had her hand up on the Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to kind of unpack a couple of things on this list. I'm wondering if it would make more sense, since the material kind of component of the process is the assessment year in adjusting property values, to kind of assume an average increase of 6%, a revenue limitation of 12% for an every year kind of process. So what you're looking at is once you've kind of reset the property values in an assessment year, then you can kind of pontificate as to whether your revenue base is limited to a kind of a 12% amount. I think the second thing I'd wonder in terms of the ratchet is if we kind of lift the idea that's not dissimilar to your bill, Senator Hansen, on kind of a tax credit model, that if you have to adjust downward, you can kind of implement the tax credit in a way that you can, I don't know if float's the right word, but you can float it back up in a flat assessment year at some point, so that you're not ratcheting down the mill levy or adjusting the gross mill levy by some kind of credit. Those would be my two comments on this list.
All right. Commissioner Pogue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to start by thanking you for the work that you did on putting together the original bill. Largely, I think even in this counter proposal, the buckets are the same. And so just as a point of process, I don't know if it makes sense for us to go through each one of these ideas one at a time rather than all together. Defer on whatever you would want to do next. But what I'd like to say in terms of the actual policy is that I do appreciate some of these suggestions for improvements to the original language. If the choices are between a cap like CPI and a cap such as the number 12%, let's say, I do think that the number is easier for local government jurisdictions to work with rather than something that can be unpredictable and not particularly relevant to the work that we do. I do appreciate the language in the original bill as to the exemptions. I feel strongly that if a community has already voted on a mill for a specific purpose, that community voice ought to be honored. And so I would like for us to hang on to that original language wherever we land on the cap. I do think that the concepts of decoupling and the primary homeowner exemption, while incredibly important, do need further study. And so I would like for this body to continue to work on those rather than leaping to implementation before session is over. And I think similarly, I feel like the idea of the taxpayer deferral and the monthly payments need more of an on-ramp to implementation that are currently addressed. I think there's support the commercial ratchet down. So if there's some way for us to delve into each one of these topics in more detail, I think that would be helpful one at a time. But that's sort of my initial reaction to both the bill and to this proposal that we have in front of us.
Thanks, Commissioner Pogue. Commissioner Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I echo Commissioner Pogue's comments and Yeoman's work on pulling together the draft and capturing everything. I do believe there's quite a bit in there that probably is, regardless of the abilities, as Commissioner Kerr noted, of the legislature to do tremendous work in the last few days of the session with only about 12 days left. I think we really have to focus on what can be implemented and understood of ideas.
Right.
hard cap, with the exceptions does make some sense. I'd kind of curious, what the 6% was intended to apply to. Coming from a county with about a 2.5% or between 2 and a 2.5% growth over the last couple of years, are we accounting for actual growth and overall property value from new construction before we apply the 6%, or would that be a decrement from, if you have a community that's not growing but values are rising versus a community that is seeing a lot of construction and values are rising, that 6% cap would be a very different limitation on revenue growth. So I think that would need to be kind of fleshed out. But I do think the ratcheting down piece for non-residential needs to be kept in there. I think smoothing, decoupling, those are the deferral program based on what we saw from the treasurer and the monthly payments. Definitely needed study, but I think these need to be continued to be studied. I think they're good, valid ideas, but I think we need to focus on what can be packaged and understood by everybody that's going to be discussing and voting on them before the 8th, if we're going to have something that our taxpayers understand going into November elections as well, if they've got some confidence that something of significance has actually been accomplished versus another promise on a ballot measure that may be more appealing. I think we've got to focus on what is explainable and doable in the next week and a half. But thank you.
I think I heard a question in there perhaps for Commissioner Terry or Furman around the hard cap concept. Do you want to maybe just make sure we're all clear on kind of your thinking on that, what you're saying it would apply to or not apply to?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The question about whether or not new construction and growth, that value comes on separately reassessed property. And I'm sure Commissioner Groth can explain that much better than I. And then the base is adjusted accordingly. So that's what helps with the non-ratchet, or helps with the ratchet down in a negative growth year. So new construction typically and currently are factored into it. So we wouldn't want to change that for the exact reasons that Commissioner Richardson just pointed out. It could be detrimental.
Was your intent that it would apply to all districts or just local government and not schools? I just want to make sure we're all understanding the proposal.
Thank you, Commissioner or Senator Hansen. I think that at this point and in the conversations that we had, it probably would not include schools because I'm not, they're so different, sorry, but there's that whole state piece and backfill piece and Amendment 23. So we didn't really factor that piece in. And when we were talking about this whole concept, the question came up, what about schools? And we're like, well, not really sure how that it would work. And so I had an opportunity to talk with Commissioner Johnson later on. And I think it's the preference that this not include schools. I know that the local government world doesn't want to see decoupling of schools with the RAR and the non-res until we have a study or we have an idea of what that looks like. But I don't want to speak for Commissioner Johnson.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would prefer this is applied to non-school taxing jurisdictions. I think the relationship with a lot of our tax structure is that if there was, schools don't see a windfall for their total program taxes. That just changes the relationship of what the state equalization amount is. And so it's in a lot of ways a different problem that we're trying to solve on that end. And therefore I would think it would be best to exclude it from this idea.
All right, and I'll encourage everybody to be close to their mics. We didn't hear that quite as well as I'd hoped. All right, just checking online. All right, and we'll go start down here, Representative Degree Kennedy, and then I'll go to my left.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that there's a lot of different concepts that are kind of floating around here, but I actually think that when we look at them all together, there's a few critical distinctions and kind of categories that we can use to think about this. I think what's been really constructive, and Representative Frizzell and I have been having a lot of conversations with the local government stakeholders around the Capitol and kind of grappling with the hard realities of this. And one of the things that I think we've become keenly aware of is that this is about hard choices. These are not simple things. And so a few realities that I think just need to be acknowledged at the outset. One, local share of property tax revenue is the entire reason we have paid off the BS factor and are finally fulfilling our K-12 obligations under Amendment 23. And so the idea of getting us back into a situation where we're lowering that local share of K-12 inevitably shifts money to the state share that cuts too deeply into either the reserve or the state education fund in a way that's pretty challenging. Secondly, I think that the local government leaders that we've been talking with have been doing some real grappling with this question of caps versus cuts and how to balance those things out. And one of the things that, we've all acknowledged earlier on with some of our discussion of the ballot measures is it's a little bit awkward for the state to be in the middle of local government budgets and their taxpayers, where whatever backfill formula we construct inevitably tries to make too many different jurisdictions fit into too few boxes. And so I think that this idea of applying some sort of reasonable cap as in lieu of deep cuts that require some sort of backfill is a pretty reasonable concept to explore for us, where, it means that we will not be imposing from the state level deeper cuts onto the local governments moving into the future, but we will put in place a growth cap that constrains that future growth. And that will essentially be a signal to the voters of Colorado that we do not want a repeat of what happened with the 2023 reassessment, where property taxes went up so sharply in 1 year. But also, I want to make clear that, this is not the only way that we're providing relief to taxpayers at this time. Local governments, when they look at their own budgets, once we solidify what the state plan is going to be, local governments will have the opportunity to decide whether they can lower their mill levies, and that will be based on their individual knowledge of their budgets. And then the state will still be in a position where we can use the levers that we have, sales and income taxes, to provide different kinds of relief to taxpayers that kind of complement that. That ends up being the state's skin in the game when the local governments are doing what they can on mill levies. So as I look at what has been framed up by Commissioners Furman and Terry here, I actually think this is an incredibly productive place for the conversation to be going, where we can still talk about kind of the long-term imbalance in non-residential assessment rates that were driven by 40 years of the Gallagher Amendment. But then broadly speaking, we put in place what we consider to be a reasonable statewide cap, and then it goes back to being a local decision-making process over the longer term. So I think that their framework, once everyone kind of absorbs what they're talking about, in many ways is not that radical a departure of the bill draft we're talking about here. I think they're still looking at changes to the non-res rates. They're still looking at the monthly payments and the deferral program pieces. But instead of having these concepts of the smoothing and the big residential reductions, we're talking about a cap for all districts except for school districts that could be in place to make sure voters know they're not going to see spikes like they did after the 2023 reassessment. So I think that this is really, really fruitful, and I hope we can stay on this topic and really dig into it.
All right, I had some hands up on this side. Who was first? Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a question going back to that conversation around whether this is for all the taxing entities or only the non-schools. So I wanted to ask Commissioner Johnson, if it's only the non-schools, isn't that a form of decoupling? Isn't that basically decoupling? I don't understand decoupling nearly well enough to know, but it seems to me that kind of is a de facto decoupling.
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Kerr. I would say it's a light form of decoupling.
Okay. Decoupling light. Okay.
Commissioner Donis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate both the bill draft and this modification that we're hearing about. I particularly appreciate this conversation about the 6% cap. It sounds a lot like the 5.5% statutory cap that was in existence. It has a lot of the same look and feel in terms of how it would be implemented. And I think that that is something that most districts can really understand and get their arms around. I also think taxpayers will appreciate knowing that there is some sort of cap on what's coming. And by doing a revenue cap by district, we'll be able to, I hope, remove some of the assessed value challenges that we're having, which will, in a sense, decouple light schools, because this won't affect schools. It'll affect, because the assessed value won't change. So I really appreciate that. I think there are a couple of considerations that need to be addressed on the 6% cap. One of them is the variability of oil and gas. So I would respectfully ask that you consider eliminating oil and gas from that measure for the limit, just because it's so volatile and it'll make it really confusing for districts as well as taxpayers, because their levy will possibly swing wildly just because of one single property valuation that's effective based on global economics rather than local economics. The other is the consideration for the prior elections, just to make sure we come to, that we're clear about whether this affects all taxing districts, excluding schools, or whether it's just taxing authorities that have not had a prior election. I think that's a really important piece that we discuss, because if we exclude all districts that had a prior election, then we're cutting out many, probably the majority, and I'm not sure that we're really implementing property tax relief like what I'm hearing. So moving on, I believe we need to absolutely remove the smoothing category. This is much more complicated on an actual value sense. This commission did not agree that smoothing at the actual value level was reasonable, and so assessors do not believe that we would be able to make this work in a way that would not simply confuse taxpayers and taxing authorities. And then assessment rate decoupling for schools. I again think that that's possible, especially if we remove the fact that it has to be specified as an assessment rate. If we can just say that we want to hold schools harmless from any adjustment to assessment rate and allow assessors to figure out the best procedure rather than locking that into statute, I think we could probably do that in a couple years and preserve that state share of the funding. So the final piece for me, I support the non-residential assessment rate reduction, but we have to come to a decision very soon on what we're doing with 24 for value, because assessors are sending out notices of value on May 1, so we're just a couple days away from that. We've already put our estimate of tax on there, and we have to certify value to districts on August 25th. So as we continue to modify what we're doing for 2024, it will simply be impossible for assessors to get that done. So copying 2023 over to 2024, unless it's just an assessment rate change, will be basically impossible for us to implement. So I strongly encourage us to look at 2024 and make sure that we're I would recommend we hold that exactly the same. And if there's a concern on backfill, we talk about that separately. That's it.
All right, thanks. Covered a lot of ground very efficiently. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's really nice having Commissioner Donis next to me to ask or talk about the very complex things, because I'm kind of a simple guy and I've got just a few simple questions. On this proposal, I wanted to just make sure that I'm reading it right, that we're not looking at the subclasses of residential any longer. Is that correct? Possible subclasses for primary versus non-primary residential.
Are you asking whether this current sub-proposal or re-proposal has that concept?
Correct.
I believe it does not.
Okay, good. The realtors were really in favor of getting rid of that. One of the things I think that we might have missed here, unless we're talking about the step down of all non-residential is a different class or a different assessment rate for vacant land, non-ag vacant land. And I'd like to make sure that we keep that in mind somewhere, maybe not this year, but in the foreseeable future, that the fact that non-ag residential vacant land is being assessed at a very high rate makes it untenable for a lot of property owners to hold on to properties that may have been in their family for generations or that they're holding on to be able to develop at some point in the future. I feel that that's being taxed or assessed at too high of a rate. We had talked about that through the course of our months here, and somehow I did not see that move forward. The third thing I'd like to just bring up and make sure that I either missed it or I'm not sure about whether the non-age related homestead exemption is going to be in place here. I know there's a bill to looking at portability, but I'd also like to look at the possibility of having a non-age related homestead exemption that could apply to all. That would be, of course, superseded by the age related senior exemption.
Well, I think we were looking at a homestead exemption.
Okay, I just want to make sure I didn't mess up there.
Yeah, the draft bill has a homestead exemption, if that's what you're referring to.
Okay.
I was just going back through my notes. I did not see a recommendation from the commission on this penultimate point that you made, unless I've missed it.
We talked, are you talking about the land piece?
Yeah, the vacant land piece.
We talked about that. That was number 2 under assessments when we made our recommendations for step down assessment rates for vacant land and non-residential property. And what I think got lost is we went more towards commercial, and I don't believe that we addressed vacant land.
All right. Well, if you've got a specific proposal on that, I'm sure we can have a chance to talk about it today.
I didn't necessarily have a specific proposal, but if I was to be asked about that, I'd like to see something more along the lines of a 15% assessment versus the 27, 28, 29 where we're at right now.
Senator Hansen, can we jump in?
Yes, please.
We're sitting here chatting. I'm wondering if it would be helpful. It sounds like there's, and recognizing that this is feedback, right, to this draft bill, wanting to just get really clear on, it sounds like there are some themes from folks, both with the folks that put this forward, but also then in kind of echoing comments around the things that they would like to see struck. And so I'm wondering if we can get really clear on what those things are. And then I was just talking with Renee around, and then that leaves a few areas, and if you want to speak to those areas, to then just kind of drill down into to discuss, and then seeing if there's any gaps beyond that as far as this new proposal goes. So
I think from what I'm hearing, there's been general agreement of those who have spoken that the ideas that are in here, some of them need more study, so they should be recognized as such so that they just don't go away completely. And that would include the smoothing, the extending of the deferral, the monthly payments, and also the decoupling as the main ideas that the commission looked at, but just not ready to implement right now. Those that are still interested in moving forward and maybe need a little bit more discussion would be a little bit about that 6% again, nailing down what it applies to and what the exceptions are, as has been discussed, of prior votes, things like that, just so they're clear on that. And then also, there's been general agreement on the non-residential. Are you in favor of the way it is for that, with the addition of what we just talked about, Commissioner Doherty just brought up on the vacant land, and then finally some real, I think, urgency about what about 24? So it seems like the discussion is, nailing down the 6% cap, what's it applied to, what are the exceptions, confirming the non-residential and what would be in that, and then also what about 24? What happens in 24? Is that fair to say there's subparts of a lot of those?
Yeah, I'm feeling like we need to spend more time on the residential part of what was put forward, because that
residential,
yeah, that's significantly different from I guess what we currently have drafted. So I want to make sure we understand the fiscal implications of that and exactly what is being proposed. And if my notes are correct, it was proposed to extend 23 into 24, but then I just heard Commissioner Donis say, let's not do that. So that feels like an area we should definitely spend some more discussion. But Commissioner Olney, did you have comments?
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And first of all, thanks to everybody's efforts, particularly the draft that's before us and the proposal to enhance, if you will. And I just want to take just a minute and say, you all are doing great. This is super complex. And I think we've really worked very hard and will continue to work. But some points, smoothing versus caps. That's almost a double whammy if you keep both of them in, because a cap sets a peak that can't be extended. So if you smooth something that's already capped, it could ratchet it down unintendedly. And usually I think they stand alone, and it could be that presentation was a while ago, but consider that. And the 6% to my colleague, Commissioner Johnson, TABOR amendment, or the TABOR limit was 5.5 and the cap set at 6. And an attorney we were talking to regarding trying to get some interpretation of the draft said, hang on, you know that 60 of the 65 special districts that I have had elections to lift that cap because 5.5 wasn't enough to meet their basic service plan. So I don't think it needs to go to 20 or 12, sorry, Commissioner Johnson. But you know, even a 7.5 or something, I think it's just something to consider in the overall. I am in agreement, non-residential ratchet down. I think that's the one consensus piece to create more parity across the various taxation things, and to consider those elections if 60 of 65 from the one. If they've already done elections, we need to be able to at least tie them in. That's a substantial amount of money that would go out for something that's already been approved. My one question, and I'm trying to get my arms around it, if we have a non-senior homestead exemption, isn't, I guess, are we reestablishing the base for those that want that exemption? Because really, what's the reason other than the affordability of the taxes? And it is a huge debt side on the other side projected. So it's just my, I mean, I'm all for targeted, and certainly the senior homestead and all that, that makes sense to me. But even for me, and I'm almost elderly. Oh man, what a tough room. But for me to just say I want an exemption because I've lived in my home for 10 years does not make sense to me. And that's my own personal, but I think the costs of it down the road are very expensive to district, state, whoever has to implement those. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll say, Commissioner Olney, the reason we had talked about doing a primary homestead exemption was that it drastically lowers the cost of implementation from the revenue side. So if we consider, for instance, I think bipartisan consensus that we don't want to do anything to hurt school finance, primary homestead is a much more targeted way to provide relief that has less impact on school finance. So I think that's the reason for that. And I will say implementation, states like Florida use this extensively, and the implementation costs are certainly not zero, but they're not exceptionally high either. So that's one of the things we could look other states to. All right, let's get a few more comments in here, and then we'll take a short break. Commissioner Castriota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to kind of piggyback on Mr. Olney's comments, that the feasibility of the implementation of these concepts really hasn't been explored to see if we can do that in time for 2025. Also, there would be a need for funding for these studies, and as we keep hearing from our assessors, software improvements A lot of these will impact how we currently process our property taxes. So back to further study is needed on a lot of these concepts. That's kind of where I land. And I think we still even need to decide, does a hard cap, one size fits all, work for all 64 counties? I'm going to guess it doesn't. So I think that there needs to be some flexibility, as we learned in our prior problems with the ratcheting down of Gallagher and Tabor. We don't want to get tied back into that same Gordian knot that we just untied. So locking numbers and formulas into the Colorado Constitution is not something I would ever support. Thank you.
And online, Commissioner Davis, and then we'll go to Commissioner Pogue.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question was for Ms. Donis. I didn't quite get what you said about moving from 23 or staying in 2024. Are you saying keeping the 2023 rates the same in 2024?
Commissioner Donis.
Thank you. Yes, thanks for giving me the opportunity to clarify. I apologize if I didn't make that clear. Assessors would prefer that 2023 rates and value adjustments be the same in 2024.
So commercial rates or non-res rates would be the 27.9, and then the residential rates would be the 6.7 with the value adjustment, and so on and so forth. Okay.
Yes, and the 30,000 and the 55,000. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And that's what I thought. And I guess just from a high level, our principles 6 and 7 were implementable and understandable. And I think this late in the game, whatever we do, we should probably keep that true for 2024 so that we don't cause our assessors to have a heart attack, and because they go out in a week or so. And then starting in 2025, we could start the slide on the non-res side. And I would rather see a residential rate that is fixed, whether it's fixed a residential rate with a value adjustment or just a fixed residential rate and not one that expires. And I do like the idea of a 6% cap, excluding new construction and those types of growth. I hear what people are saying about those values or those taxes in the past having been exempted already. However, they were exempted under Gallagher, which would have had a residential cap on top of it. Whereas today Gallagher is gone, as there is no residential growth cap, if you will. So I think it's reasonable for that 6% cap to apply for mill levies or taxes that had already been previously exempted. And those are my comments and thoughts for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Pogue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just 2 points of clarification. So Rennie gave us a list of things that we all would prefer to study. It was 4 things: smoothing, decoupling, the deferral, and the 12 monthly payments. I would also like to see us not drop the primary resident exemption off the list of things to study. I think that is incredibly important for many communities across the state. The other point of clarification is around the voter approved mills. I wasn't suggesting that the de-Gallagherization votes or the de-Brucing votes be something that get honored, but I was suggesting that if a jurisdiction has passed a mill levy for a specific purpose, for example, regional transit authorities, and it has gone to a vote of the people, that those types of mills ought to be respected rather than overruling an electorate that has already voted. So just 2 points of clarification.
All right. Thanks very much. I think we'll take the 2 comments down here and then we'll pause for a short break. So Representative Frizzell, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I always come back to why we're here to begin with. And we are responding to the repeal of Gallagher without being replaced. And that opened the door for these dramatic increases that in property taxes that our citizens have really experienced and suffered through. The other piece of it is the inconsistent funding of service providers. They have literally not been able to predict what was going to happen from one year to the next. And I think everybody's seeking consistency. I don't think we can unring the bell on value increases, but we can definitely ensure that this doesn't happen again. And I appreciate the conversation today. I appreciate the revenue growth limits that our stakeholders have been willing to adopt. We are here to really contemplate a new way to mitigate these spikes in taxes due to increases in property values. And we need to be able to make sure that the citizens of the state have confidence in their local governments, have confidence in that we here in this building are working on their behalf. And that's important because right now they have not felt a great deal of consistency in what we've produced. So I am excited about moving forward. I also want to echo the other commissioners' sentiments. The work of our staff has been amazing. So I really want to thank you all. And I want to thank our chair for his efforts on this matter as well.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Capelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also want to echo everyone's thanks of you guys for all your work on this. I just wanted to make a note about the exemption. As you know, I'm supportive of an exemption, but I'm just sort of trying to model it versus the existing flat exemption and some of the other things like the Minnesota model we've been talking about, et cetera. And I want to note that the way this one looks, the way it's currently set out, the flat exemption of 55,000 all the way across. This one is just 10% up to 75,000, meaning up to the value of a $750,000 home essentially, and then gets capped at 75,000. So if you look at like a line that's flat, it tips down like this. You can see that. So that it's a lot less of an exemption for lower cost homes all the way up to 750,000. And then it goes higher than the current exemption, which is 55,000. So essentially higher cost homes get a higher exemption, right, than they did under the previous model, and lower cost homes get a lower exemption than they did under the previous model. So I would like to see a way to structure the exemption so that it has, it's a little bit more progressive and has a more positive impact on homes below, whether it's the median home value or if we're going to pick 750,000, and then doesn't go quite as high as it does for properties above. I think that would end up looking a little more equitable and also probably save money. I think that that high $75,000 exemption for all properties above 750 probably tips the total cost of the exemption to above what it currently costs at 55,000. Although I would rely on the staff to check those numbers for me. Thank you.
All right, let's take a short break. It is 10 of right now. Let's come back at 3 o'clock and we'll continue the discussion. I think we'll restart with the discussion of the ballot initiatives with Mr. Svetsky. And we will get started. We're going to ask Mr. Sabetsky to come back up to the table. We'll come back to order. Mr. Sabetsky, thanks for coming back. I know as we saw you, just an hour and a half ago, since then, the title board has wrapped up their work so we can understand exactly what transpired. And I do want to remind folks that part of our statutory remit, of course, was to have a recommendation or not recommendation. I guess the way to say that is we would vote on a motion to recommend the relevant property tax ballot measures. And so with that in mind, let me turn it over to Mr. Sabetsky to catch us up on what has transpired and ultimately what we still need to weigh in on. Mr. Sabetsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Greg Sabetsky, Chief Economist with Legislative Council staff. Great to be back before the commission this afternoon. Before you should have a couple things that were sent to commissioners. I don't know if you have hard copies. There ought to be a memo dated today, as well as a slide deck that I'm going to run through here briefly. And you'll see this as we go through the slide deck, but there were a group of 7 measures that were reheard today in the title board. To explain what that means, these measures were all heard last week at the title board's meeting. And then either proponents or opponents can file a motion for rehearing where they say, we believe the title board made a mistake. And so there were 7 motions for rehearing that were filed, or 8 motions concerning 7 measures. All of those rehearings occurred today. And as a result of the rehearings, there are 2 measures that are in the memo that are now found to not have a single subject. And so those are not moving forward in the process. I'll identify those when we get to them, but they are Initiative 260, which is one of the luxury property tax measures, and Initiative 303, which is the measure that would have imposed a limit on the amount of tax that can be levied on each individual parcel. So those will appear in your memo, but they're no longer going to appear in this presentation because they no longer have titles that have been set by the board. I'll note, though, it is possible for proponents or opponents to dispute the title board's final finding upon rehearing by submitting a motion directly to the Colorado Supreme Court. That will happen likely in one or more of these cases, and it's up to the Supreme Court to finally close the book there. Additionally, important to note, while the title board meeting, I believe, is still going on, all of the property tax content before the title board has been resolved. So the title board's done for the 2023-24 ballot cycle. They start here in a couple months with their hearings for the 2025-26 election cycle. So you've heard lots of presentations of this type from me over the course of your work as a commission. We are now down to 10 outstanding ballot measures. So from the 51 that were submitted to the title board, there are 10 that remain. One of those measures is on the ballot, Initiative 50. One has petition forms approved for circulation, Initiative 108. And there are 8 measures titled after the 10 that were revisited today. So I'm not going to go through each of these in excruciating detail. I did that for you 2 weeks ago. Also, the content is in the memo, but to summarize briefly what's still pending as potential ballot measures for the 2024 election, there are 6 measures that cut or limit property taxes. 2 of those are from Michael Fields and Suzanne Taheri, 1 from Tom Kim and Annalise Steele, and 3 from David DeVia and Michael Fields. The ones that were not found to not have a single subject are measures that were withdrawn by proponents last week. And so that's why these numbers are so much smaller than what you saw 2 weeks ago. Of these 6, there are 4 that cut assessment rates. In all cases, those cut both residential and non-residential assessment rates and or apply subtractions of the type that I know the commission's very familiar with. One is a measure that limits growth in statewide tax revenue. That is Initiative number 50, and one that limits growth in assessments. That's Initiative number 97. So those aren't new. Of the 4 measures that reduce assessment rates, there are 3 that impose a one-time reduction in assessment rates that then is is a reduction that applies indefinitely after that period of time. Initiative 108, which cuts to 5.7% res and 24% non-res. Initiative 300, which cuts to 5.3% res and 25.5% non-res. And Initiative 298, which cuts to 5.7% res with a $55,000 actual value subtraction and 25.5% non-res. All of those apply beginning in property tax year 2025 and ongoing. There's also one measure outstanding, Initiative 296, that has a step down where there are initial reductions in assessment rates that apply in 2025, and the amount of the rate reductions ramps up through 2029. We expect these measures to have similar fiscal impacts. All of the measures that apply immediately would reduce property taxes by between $3 and $3.1 billion, according to our analysis. The phased-in measure has a smaller impact up front that ramps up over time. So about $670 million, excuse me, in 2025, 1.3 billion in 2026, et cetera. We expect the state budget obligation for total program funding for schools to be between $800 and $900 million. And then similarly, that phased-in measure has a progressive effect there. You may remember that many of the original submissions in this batch of measures had a reimbursement to the extent practicable within the state budget. Those measures have all been withdrawn. So the only backfill requirements are in Initiative 108, which requires a backfill for all revenue losses that it would effectuate. And then the other three assessment rate reductions don't require any state reimbursements for lost local revenue beyond through the normal School Finance Act. Initiative 50, we've talked about at length before. I have a slide here that gives you the same information that I think you already know about this measure. Same with Initiative number 97. Again, that's a measure that's sort of been stopped at the same point in the process for a long time. Proponents haven't had petition forms approved, but they still could if they chose to. And so I wanted to make sure that it was here for the sake of completeness. As a note, the Commission has already taken votes not to endorse Initiative 50, Initiative 97, or Initiative 108. The other three initiatives on this slide, 296, 298, and 300, are initiatives on which you have not taken a position because those were pending title board action. On the other side, there are 4 measures outstanding that would limit the impact of property tax limits. All 4 of these are from Scott Wasserman and Ed Ramey. 2 of these you have already taken a position on. Those are Initiative 95 and Initiative 96. You decided to recommend Initiative 95 and not to recommend Initiative 96. The other 2 you have not yet taken a position on. Initiative 96 is the luxury residential property tax that applies as a means of offsetting the revenue reduction attributable to a property tax limit, as a additional property tax that would apply on homes with value of at least $2 million. You may remember that there was a different version of this that would have applied on homes with value of at least $5 million. That measure was found not to have a single subject at the title board meeting today. And so that measure is no longer active. Initiative 269, you have not taken a position on, so I'll spend a little bit more time on it. This is a measure that if the local share of total program funding for school finance falls below 50%, would increase the non-residential assessment rate to 32%, except that the non-residential assessment rate of 32% would not apply to property being used by businesses that meet the Small Business Administration's definition of small business. One important note here is our staff expects that this would trigger, even if not for any additional property tax cuts. We expect that under current law, the local share will be less than 50% of total program funding for school finance in the first year for which this would apply. And so we assess this as being a property tax increase, as opposed to a measure that would have a conditional impact only if there's a decrease elsewhere. We expect that the measure on its own would increase property tax revenue by about $300 million in property tax year 2026 and decrease the state share of total program funding by about 100 million because the local share would increase. Initiative 261 is another measure where you haven't taken a position. This is a measure that would allow the state to retain and spend revenue in excess of the state TABOR limit in order to reimburse local governments for their lost revenue attributable to the imposition of a statewide limit on property taxes. Finally, there's Initiative 95. This is a measure that the Commission has already taken a position on. You chose to recommend this measure at your meeting 2 weeks ago. This would require local voter approval for a statewide limit on property taxes to apply in the local jurisdiction. Mr. Chair, that was my quick summary. I wanted to make it quick. I imagine that there will be questions, but we've gone into this in some detail before, and I didn't want to be too much of a redundancy before you this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Savetsky. That was great. Kind of refresh our memories. I would ask the commission members each to open up page 2 and 3 of the memo, because I think, if I heard you correctly, what we have not yet weighed in on are 260 through 303. And if you could remind us which one of those, after the action at title board today, are there any that were knocked out? So we make sure we just cross those off our list, and then we'll take action on the remaining ones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the two that, so you're right, 260 to 303 are the numbers that you care about. That was, want to make sure I get the math right. There had been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 measures that you hadn't taken action on, and 2 of those are no longer active, which are Initiative 260 and Initiative 303. Initiative 303.
Okay.
Initiative 260 was the luxury property tax measure. Initiative 303 was the parcel level limit.
That's perfect. So that gets us down to page 3, essentially, of your memo.
There we go. Look at that.
Okay, that worked out gret. All page 3, everybody.
That you still, I believe, would want to take action on are 261, 269, 296, 298, and 300.
Okay, that's terrific. So that gives us 5 initiatives that we need to look at today. Let me turn to the commission, see if there are questions for Mr. Savetsky about those remaining 5 initiatives. Make sure everybody has all the information they need to cast their preference vote. Any questions for LCS? I am not seeing any, which means you did a great job last time, because we're all feeling good about what we've got in front of us. Anything online? Commissioner Pogue? Anybody? Commissioner Davis, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. Are any of the initiatives that have been approved by title board in conflict with each other? And what happens when 2 initiatives that are in conflict with each other both get passed?
What a wonderful question. Mr. Savetsky is ready with an answer.
One moment, please, Commissioner Davis. I'm just going to pull the slide deck back up here.
Hold, please.
Or maybe I'm not. Commissioner Davis, I can speak to that. So there are initiatives that are in conflict with each other, but I don't think it is reasonable to assume that the initiatives that conflict with each other would all go forward. The initiatives that conflict with each other are ones that set different assessment rates for the same classes of property. And all of those initiatives are being offered by the same proponents, with the exception of the initiative that resets the non-residential rate, which is initiative number, somebody will get this faster than I will, but it's initiative number 269. So let me bracket initiative 269 to answer your question as it applies to the other initiatives. All of the initiatives that I discussed first, the ones that would reduce assessment rates, are in conflict because they would set assessment rates at different levels, but they're all being brought by the same proponents. And I think it's fair to assume that those proponents won't bring initiatives that conflict with one another all the way to the ballot. And so I don't anticipate that being an issue. Initiative 269 does conflict with all of the initiatives that reduce the non-residential rate, because initiative 269 would raise the non-residential rate to 32% for most non-residential property. and the initiatives that would lower the non-residential rate, which are Initiative 108, Initiative 298, Initiative 296, and Initiative 300, would conflict with that measure. Those measures don't contemplate one another. Neither of those sets of measures says to the reviser of statute, hey, if voters approve me and a measure that conflicts with me, I control in that instance. And so that would be a matter for downstream interpretation by the reviser and likely by the courts. I know in some instances, the controlling factor is the initiative that receives a higher percentage of votes, but I don't know for sure if it's a higher percentage of votes at the election or a higher number of votes at the election. And I think that there's been some disagreement over that in the past. So at risk of giving the commission bad information, I would say that there's just some unknowns there about how we would resolve exactly that, that set of inconsistencies.
Any follow-ups? Any further questions? Commissioner Donis.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm just curious, do you have any insight as to why these are the assessment rates that were selected? I mean, now we have 5.3% for residential and 24% for commercial, which is, I believe, different than we've seen before.
Mr. Zabetsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Donis, no, I don't. I'm sorry.
Yes, Mayor Castriota.
Thank you. So 296 or 261 rather, or both, they're not constitutional measures, right? It doesn't
I believe
say.
they're all statutory that are remaining,
Okay,
if I'm reading the memo correctly.
except for 50.
Right, of the ones we're looking at today, they're all statutory.
Okay, thank you.
I just note for the record, of the ones in my presentation, Initiative 97 is also constitutional. But I believe that the chair is right. The ones that you're considering today are statutory measures.
Further questions? All right, seeing none, again, a huge thank you, Mr. Zabetsky, for following in real time the proceedings at the title board, happening, what, 2 blocks away, if I remember right? All right, well, with that, any final discussion on any of the initiatives? Well, we can have some general discussion, and then I'll call for final discussion as we take the votes, just like we did last time. All right, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Property Tax Commission support initiative number 261.
All right, that is a proper motion. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Commission members Baisley,
Did he leave?
Yeah.
He left. He is excused.
Capelli,
Yes.
Castriota,
Yes.
Degree Kennedy,
Yes.
Davis,
No.
Jonas,
No.
Doherty,
No.
Frizzell,
No.
Furman,
No.
Groff, Johnson,
Yes.
Olney,
Yes.
Pogue,
Yeah.
Richardson,
No.
Van Rye, Terry,
Yes.
Vic,
Yes.
Kerr,
Aye.
Mr. Chair.
Aye. That is recommended 11-7. That brings us to initiative 269. Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Property Tax Commission support initiative number 269.
All right, that is a proper motion. Any discussion, Commission? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Commission members Baisley excused, Capelli,
No.
Castriota,
Yes.
Degree Kennedy,
Yes.
Davis,
No.
Jonas,
No.
Doherty,
No.
Frizzell,
No.
Berman,
Pass.
Groff, Johnson.
No.
Olney,
No.
Hoag,
Yes.
Richardson,
No.
Van Rye, Terry,
No.
Vic,
Yes.
Kerr,
Aye.
Berman,
No.
Mr. Chair.
Aye. That fails on a vote of 6-12. All right, to initiative 296. Any discussion? Seeing none, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Property Tax Commission support initiative number 296.
All right, that's proper motion. Please call the roll.
Commission members Baisley excused, Capelli,
No.
Castriota,
No.
Degree Kennedy.
No.
Davis,
Yes.
Jonas,
No.
Doherty,
No.
Frizzell,
No.
Berman,
No.
Groff.
No.
Johnson,
No.
Olney,
No.
Hoag,
No.
Richardson,
Yes.
Van Rye, Terry,
No.
Vic,
No.
Kerr,
No.
Mr. Chair.
No. That fails on a vote of 3-15. That brings us to initiative 298. Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Property Tax Commission support initiative number 298.
All right, that's proper motion. A discussion. Seeing none, please call the roll.
Commission members Baisley excused, Capelli,
No.
Castriota,
No.
Degree Kennedy.
No.
Davis,
Yes.
Jonas,
Yes.
Doherty,
No.
Frizzell,
No.
Berman,
No.
Groff,
Can I explain my vote? Are we going for that?
That was 35 seconds ago.
35 seconds, should have discussed it. Of all of.
If you can give the mic near to your mouth.
Of all of these proposals, I actually like this one the best, but I still think that the cut in residential assessment rate is too aggressive, so I'm going to say no.
Thanks for that.
Johnson,
No.
Olney,
No.
Hoag,
No.
Richardson,
No.
Van Rye, Terry,
No.
Vic,
No.
Kerr,
No.
Mr. Chair.
No. That fails on a vote of 2-16. To initiative 300, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the Property Tax Commission support initiative number 300.
All right, proper motion. Any discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Commission members Baisley excused, Capelli,
No.
Castriota,
No.
Degree Kennedy. Davis,
Yes.
Jonas,
No.
Doherty,
No.
Frizzell,
No.
Berman,
No.
Groff, Johnson,
No.
Olney,
No.
Hoag,
No.
Richardson,
No.
Van Rye, Terry,
No. No.
Vic,
No.
Kerr,
No.
Mr. Chair.
No. That fails on a vote of 1-17. All right, members, thank you. I believe we have completed our statutory obligations as I read them. Very good. Well, we've got now votes on all of the relevant titles that have been finalized. So thank you for working through that in two tranches. Appreciate that engagement very much. All right, that brings us back to our discussion that we had started down the track of before our break. Let me maybe ask Keystone to kind of help us reset.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the discussion has boiled down, most people have focused on the issues of a cap, what the amount would be, what's excluded from that cap. Secondly is whether there should be adjustments to the residential and some actual value adjustments. Third would be the non-residential ratchet down. And finally, which is very important, is what about 24? The other issues, people have expressed interest in continuing, but having those not be in the bill to continue to study, and those would be decoupling, the extension of the deferral, the primary residence exemption expansion, decoupling, and the monthly payments. Is that a fair summary? And maybe Mr. Chair, if we could have the commission think about those in terms of what else, what questions they have, what thoughts they have. Are there things that can come to a informal consensus that would help with regard to commenting on the bill? And I don't know, of those four, it seems like the non-residential, there was a fair amount of agreement on that in terms of both the ratcheting down and the timing. Is that fair to say, or are there other folks that have thoughts or concerns about the non-residential ratchet down?
But I think for me, I think we had a great discussion on this during our regular meetings, and I think there is a lot of support for this idea. I think for me, I want to make sure that in our next phase of our discussion, we understand the fiscal impact of the res and non-res changes that have been proposed either in the bill or in this I guess, recapitulation of parts of the bill. And so, I think the non-res, we got the estimate from Mr. Hansen earlier on kind of what that would look like. Might be good to spend a little bit more time on that, particularly if it starts now or in a year hence. And then I think the other part we need to take a hard look at is if we continue everything we're doing in 23, what's that going to cost us in 24? I think we all need to leave here with a clear understanding of implications of those two parts of the proposal.
Right. So looking at that, Mr. Chair, it seems like there are kind of three things. You've got the rate reductions, which would be non-res and res, and that has an impact on backfill. So what would be the cost of that? And then secondly, very similarly, is carrying forward the 23 law into 24. What's the impact of that? The cap, as I think Representative Degree Kennedy pointed out, is kind of, that doesn't necessarily have the backfill to it, but it's another tax relief sort of limiter thing. So to your point, maybe we should start with the 23-24, and because that seems the most imminent to accomplish for the tax system, and revisit the fiscal impact of that and see how the commission feels, how's that weigh, and what would be a recommendation to do in that year. Does that make sense?
Yep. It's great. And I wonder if we could invite Mr. Hansen back up to help us with each of those, the res and the non-res implications for what we're looking at right now.
All right, I'm not sure where to start here, but what I presented earlier was extending all of the value reductions and assessment rates into property tax year 2024. I estimated as about a reduction in local property tax revenue across all districts of about 1.1 billion, and then increase in the school finance obligation of about 380 million.
All right, Commissioner Groff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And David, when you were doing that calculation, that's the loss, or it's not really a lot, that's the adjustment from what it would have been in 2022 if those adjustments hadn't been made. But can you tell me, based on the backfill calculations, what the backfills would be? Because I don't think we would be backfilling all of that under the 238 and the 001 backfill mechanisms.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't, and I think as Mr. Sabetsky was kind of mentioning earlier, is those were really tailored to those pieces of legislation. And I'm not sure if it's the right context to bring, I haven't modeled them yet, but I'm not sure if it's the right context also to apply them to extending into the next property tax year, these reductions. I mean, just if it helps to break it down a little bit, I have not segmented all the numbers all the way, but this does seem like it will, I mean, there's quite a, under current law, sizable increase, maybe double digit, 14 or 15% increase in residential assessed valuation under current law, and it would bring it down lower to extend those reductions, obviously. On the non-residential side, we do have oil and gas that is impacting the property tax year 2024. And so on the non-residential side, maybe a little bit more negative growth in AV on the non-residential side. Maybe that adds a little bit more context to breaking that down into its different parts.
Continue, Commissioner Groff.
Thank you. So just as, just because we don't have enough wrinkles yet in this conversation, I'm going to also put on the table that we could carry forward the $55,000 and $30,000 adjustments. We don't necessarily have to carry forward the 6.7 and the 27.9. So we really have a few different component pieces that we could deal with. But I would tell you that trying to impose a different value reduction scheme for 2024 really is unenforceable. It's uncalculable from a standpoint of the assessors. We did have, the assessors had a meeting. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, assessors, for allowing me to participate in that on Wednesday morning. And they just don't think there's any way they could get that done in time for certification of values by August 25th. So you would be looking at, number one, could they even do it? They can't do it in that time frame. You'd be looking at a similar mess to what we had this year. We'd have to push out all of those dates again. And I don't think we want to do it. So if there's something we can do to be calming for 2024 and build on new ideas for 2025, I highly recommend it. And if we can't afford it, we could look to change the assessment rates, but leave the 55 and 30 alone. My suggestion.
Mr. Hansen, are you able to break those out for us of the total? Do you have a subtotal perhaps?
So I did just, as we were talking a little bit earlier, just look at extending those value reductions on their own and letting assessment rates go back to or stay where they were under current law. And it was closer to like a $600 million local property tax revenue reduction and increase in the school finance obligation of closer to $200 million, just to put a little bit of context around it.
So that's for res only or both categories?
That was both categories.
Okay, so let's just make sure everybody's got that down. I'm taking notes here along with everybody else. If the rates weren't changed or the lower rates weren't continued, maybe is another way to say it, but we did the 55 and the 30 in the two categories. So 55 for res, $30,000 reduction on the commercial. That would result in $600 million impact. So essentially half. It's roughly half is what I'm hearing you say. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yes.
All right, questions on that? Commissioner Terry.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is my ignorance in the school finance world. So since the school finance bill has already been passed, does the 200 million for schools, is that already, how was that factored into this current school finance bill? Since it was being prospective for the next budget year. If not, then how does the school finance world calculate for this unknown? I mean, they had to have calculated for some sort of res and non-res.
They did not.
Value. I guess I just don't know. You don't?
No, so I think I can answer this one clearly. So if you're asking about Senate Bill 188, which is the School Finance Act, or the state budget, which I forget the bill number, but the long bill and the school finance bill do not take into account anything but current law. So whatever relief we extend into 2024, we would need to have some type of mechanism for backfill. Otherwise, there would be a reduction for all the school districts.
So isn't 238 considered current law?
Yes, but it expires at the end of property tax year 23.
Got it. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Let's go down this direction. I'll start with Commissioner Richardson.
Yeah, I know we're talking about the reductions and keeping those forward, and the fact that the backfill formula that existed may need to be relooked because we don't have the revaluation changes, but we do know the impact of what was done for this year did leave, I believe it was 5 counties actually went negative. So I think we would have to look at any backfill formula to at least hold harmless. If that meant others maybe didn't get a bit of an increase or slightly less than an increase that came with the backfill, but we certainly shouldn't put a county like Prowers back in a negative 14% for a second year.
Yeah, I think I think you are bringing up exactly the data that we looked at together of the negative impact of flat value reductions, especially on the Eastern Plains. Representative Frizzell, I think you were next.
Thank you. And for Property Tax Administrator Groff, so we have statute around value changes in intervening years. And so if we went with kind of what you're suggesting, where we maintain the $55,000-$30,000 value reduction, but change the assessment rate. So I just want to confirm that that statute around intervening year value change applies only to actual value, not assessed value.
Thank you for the question. Yes, that needing to keep the value the same for 2 years is talking about actual value, not taxable value. So you could change, you could go back to what Senate Bill 238 said, that with true respect, a little bit of correction for Senator Hansen, the 26.4 on ag, the 26.4 on renewable energy, that's actually part of 238. That was actually part of 293, I think, but that carries forward into tax year 24. But the resident and the 6.8% for multifamily also carries over into 24. And then 238 required the Division of Property Taxation to submit a report. We did that report and submitted it, so the residential assessment rate would not go back to 715. It would go back to 7.06 if the legislature were to adopt it, but that was the amount that was recommended in our report. So 238 results wouldn't be quite all the way back to what's the maximum that's allowable under statute, but that's where you would look. You would go back to 27.9, I'm pretty sure, or 29 rather, on commercial.
That's correct. Yeah, that's my memory of it too. Additional questions? Representative DeGree Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that this is an important conversation because I don't know that I feel stuck on any one combination of variables for what we do here. For me, I think the key question is, do we have the resources to pay for it? I think that, the long-term backfill or long-term increased state share for K-12 is hard. But the one year, it's arguably doable depending on how big the magnitude of what we're talking about could potentially work. On the residential side, I will say, there's certainly value on the 55K value subtraction in terms of how it helps people with lower value homes to a greater degree. And I think there's probably broader support for that provision. So if the assessors do believe that we could continue that element of the policy, as long as we're not tinkering with the formula in a way that makes it different from last year's, I think there's something to be said for that. But I would want to see the total dollar impact. And I'm kind of curious to see if we paired that with the rate that Commissioner Groff just mentioned that they're proposing of 7.06, which is current law, or what in theory, actually, that's a good question about how that plays out since it's a recommendation from the division to the legislature. But I think that's interesting. On the non-res side, I initially really did like the 30K subtraction, but the more I've come to think about it, the more I've realized that an awful lot of businesses are renters in the first place, renting a unit on a larger strip. And so I just am not really convinced that the 30K value subtraction on non-res does as much as it would for a single family home. So I think that, what would be worth kind of exploring is, in the longer term picture, we're talking about this gradual reduction of the non-res rate. I could see us exploring what it would be like to freeze the 27.9 non-res rate through 2024 and see what the total dollar impact of that would be, together with a continuation of the 55K value subtraction on top of a 7.06 residential assessment rate. My theory is that that's probably more expensive than the state could pay for if we had the more robust the backfill formula. But the last thing I may throw in here is, and Mr. Hansen, I don't know what capacity we have to model this, but I would be curious if we have an ability to kind of mock up what the current revenue of all the local districts would be and figure out a backfill formula that essentially holds harmless compared to previous year revenue, as opposed to cutting more deeply. So, just a few simple things to model.
Yeah. Commissioner Groff.
Just because we did a lot of that, let's throw one more complication into this. You had two reimbursement processes. One reimbursement was under 238. The other reimbursement was under 001. They actually were quite different in their generosity. So as you look to backfill, you have some flexibility and some examples on that as well. 001 was much less expensive, but it was also less generous. 238 reimbursed quite more generously. And so that would be something else to consider. If you raise the residential assessment rate, but keep the 55, as you're looking at all those iterations, there might be a sweet spot where it's not going to be as expensive to backfill and you're not shocking taxpayers.
Commissioner Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got one small piece and then one larger. Just to the business lop off of 30,000. That actually does very much help small businesses because those who are leasing are paying the property taxes. The owner is not paying the property taxes in the majority of the leases that are out there that are triple net. So I would not be in favor of removing that. But now going to the larger question, and I may just not be that smart. I am a realtor. I am not dealing with budgets all the time. But with this increase in property taxes for 2023, which rolls into 2024, we're talking about a decrease in the total revenues. Why are we so set on backfilling when budgets went up so significantly based upon the increase in revenue? And again, I may be incorrect in this, and I apologize to all the districts. I apologize to the counties for saying this. but this was a windfall. And we're talking about backfilling from the state when we know that the backfill is going to be very difficult to do so. So I'd really love some thoughts on that.
Well, that's going to invite some comment, I have no doubt.
I also just want to acknowledge Commissioner Pogue online with her.
Yeah, let me see if there's any quick response to Commissioner Doherty, and then I'll go to Commissioner Pogue. And Commissioner Pogue, you may want to respond to that as well. Yeah, I'll start with you, Commissioner Pogue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the question, Commissioner Doherty, but I think there's a couple of factors that I would encourage you to think about. The first is it's the unpredictability of what is happening that I think makes the backfill more important. You know, we don't just say in August, let's figure out our budget, right? There is months and months of planning and many, many years of forecasting that go into making sure that we can ensure services for our constituents. So when the values change dramatically, in last year's case, 3 months before we had a statutory requirement to pass our final budget, without some kind of a backfill mechanism, it makes it remarkably difficult for particularly, I think, our smaller counties to manage their resources effectively. And I think that is the same for the special districts, although certainly I would defer to Commissioner Terry. I think the other thing you have to remember is that local governments, much like our homeowners, experience cycles in our revenue. And so many of us are still trying to catch up from the layoffs and the cuts in services and the deferment of the purchase of infrastructure, capital, et cetera, from the recession. And so when we see increases of revenue, we're sort of like squirrels trying to put as many nuts away as possible for wherever the next downturn in the market happens. So hopefully that gives you some sense. Now, do I think long-term local governments want to be in the business of relying on the state to backfill us? I don't. But I think as long as we are continuing to make changes every year, it's very difficult for us to manage that process effectively for our communities. So just moving on to my question, I actually had a question from Commissioner Groff, but Mr. Chair, I'm happy to hold that if you want to delve into this issue more.
Sorry, I want to make sure I understood the last comment there. What was being offered?
She's just wanting to say if you want to stick with Commissioner Doherty's.
Yeah, do you want to stay on that? Because I actually had a different question I was raising my hand for.
Oh, all right. I tell you what, let's pause and just see if there's any other folks who want to chime in on this part of the conversation. Commissioner Terry.
Thank you very much. I could not agree with my colleague, Commissioner Pogue more. She explained that very mindfully and very well. I'm going to add that even in non-downturn economies, we have to do planning for big capital projects. Fire districts buy fire trucks that used to be $300,000 are now $1 million, and those are ordered and takes 3 to 5 years to get them. So the costs have considerably gone up. And then just briefly, the costs of employees, the cost of health insurance, the cost of the inflation of our taking care of the employees, which are ever so important to provide the services that everybody relies on. But in addition to that, you've got the inflationary costs of goods and services, such as concrete went up 40+%, and we want to make sure our roads are paved and our bridges are secure. So those are the kinds of things that balance off of where the continued discussion around that we might be sitting on piles of cash, because we're not. And we sat through in a recession without reimbursement on various levels. So it's really a pain point for us. And I think, again, thank you, Commissioner Pogue. You explained the budgetary ups and downs so well. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else before we go back to Commissioner Pogue? Commissioner Pogue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 2 questions. I want to make sure I'm understanding what Commissioner Groff suggested. If we raised the assessment rate for residential to 7.05 or whatever the recommendation was, but kept the exemption where it was last year, wouldn't some primary residents see, I'm sorry, not primary residents, some residential owners see an increase in their tax bill in 2024?
I'm just going to go ahead and dialogue. I think that's what we're supposed to do. Yes, the short answer to that is yes. But what you're looking at is the taxable value. So their taxable value would be more for 2024 if you were to go to the higher assessment rates and leave the adjustments where they are. If you don't do any adjustment and you go to the higher assessment rates, I think that we were presented that in December, and it was around a 22% actual value increase. Or not actual value, but taxable value increase. So where this would be reflected, Commissioner Hoag, is on the taxable value that comes to the taxing jurisdictions. I'm hesitant to say that their taxes will go up because I still think that's a local government decision. So you will have the opportunity, you will have a little bit more taxable value upon which you make your mill levy decisions. Does that mean that constituents may have tax bills that go up? Yes, they do. But I want to remind you that that's actually an opportunity every year based on mill levy votes, based on floatable mill levies. It's quite rare that your taxes are the same from one year to the next in an assessment cycle because local governments set their budgets every year. Does that help? I don't know that that was clear enough. So it'll be on you.
I mean, I think that's right? You can rely on local governments to float their mills to compensate for that. I get what you're saying now.
Right. You will have more taxable value upon which to make your decision for your mill levies. And if you decide to keep your mill levies the same, then your constituents would experience an increase in their taxes for 2025.
All right. Further discussion on this point. Does everyone feel like you've got a good handle on the numbers that Mr. Hansen shared with us? Yeah, Mr. Fagan.
Caveat, but if it was 7.06, that would narrow the revenue loss to local districts because you did the 600 million that you last talked about. What was the residential assessment rate for that?
Yeah, it was modeled to 7.06%, the recommendation. Yeah.
Oh, so, okay, this is a really important point because so you modeled 706 and that resulted in 1.1 billion or 380 million change. Is that right?
Sorry, and maybe hopefully, can clarify here. So the 1.1 billion was modeled off of extending 6%.
6.7.
And yes, and modeled against the 6.8% multifamily, the 7.06% recommendation for 2024. And then second run was just extending the value reductions, but letting the assessment rates be those assessment rates. So go back up from the 2023 6.7% to 7.06. So there wouldn't be a change in the assessment rate there, just the value reduction for that second run.
Gotcha.
And hopefully I said that clearly.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. Is everybody clear? No, I'm here.
No, okay.
Head shaking. Let's try that one more time.
And maybe this is worth like a follow-up to the commission to spell it out. But so the first model run was based on the 30,000 reduction in commercial, 55,000 reduction in residential, going from 7.06 down to 6.7% for the 2024 property tax year, and going for multifamily 6.8 to 6.7%, and then non-residential going for most classes, going from the 29% to 27.9%. Those changes, 1.1 billion modeled for the 2024 property tax year. So, but if you let those assessment rates just go back to, just go from 23 to 24, where they're going to be under current law, and just extend value reductions. That was the second set of numbers that I modeled.
Right, so it'd be 706 for res and 29 for non-res, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so is everyone up to date on what those numbers correspond to? We're still seeing head shakes. Should I take a run at it?
Sure.
I think I've got my notes down here correctly. All right. So scenario 1 is we extend everything we're doing now into next year. So 6.7 RAR, $55,000 value reduction on the res side. On the non-res side, we stay at 27.9 and do a 30K value reduction. That results in a $1.1 billion change to local and $380 million to school finance.
Correct.
Okay. Scenario 2 is we do just the value reductions. We let the RAR go to 706. We let the non-res go to 29, but we keep the 55 and the 30K. That is approximately half. $600 million local, approximately $200 million school.
Correct. Well stated.
All right. My notes were correct. Everybody got it? Commissioner Donis.
Just one more follow-up. And the backfill was calculated using rules from 238 or rules from Senate Bill 1 in terms of population, or just total? I'm seeing head shakes.
Commissioner Groff.
I'm sorry, but I don't think we've decided on any backfill yet.
We're just trying to figure out what's the hit.
I understand, but
Or
what?
change, I should say.
So the total hit is 1.1 is what you're saying. And then if we make
Plus
adjustments.
380.
Plus the 380. If
Yeah.
we make then additional adjustments based on population and 10%, if they had a 10% change, then
Yeah,
that'll
growth.
reduce that.
Measure that we've done in the past, right? So that would bring it down as it did in the previous legislation. So that's spot on. But I think step 1 is, okay, if we extend everything we're doing, what's it look like? If we extend just the 55 and the 30, what does it look like? Now we've got a good picture of that implication for this proposal that we've been looking at for the last couple hours. Commissioner Groff.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The key, the bill that you had drafted came up with a different methodology for reducing value. It was the 10% up to 750. It had no adjustment for commercial property, and it did restore the assessment rates to what we're talking about. 6.8 for multifamily, 7.06 for residential, 29 for commercial, for most commercial.
No.
No?
No, it went from 27.9 to 27.5.
For 2024.
25. Yeah.
I thought that was for 2025. But
Right, but just to say, we start at 27.9. That does not jump back up in the draft that folks were handed before the meeting.
I misspoke there. So, so the biggest thing we're talking about here, if we can break it up to these component pieces, if you will, my first request was, do we do the 55? Do we do the 30? If we don't do the 55, do we do the 10% up to 750? It's kind of a Rubik's Cube. So.
Rubik's Cubes are easy compared to this one.
Not for me.
I wish this was a Rubik's Cube.
But
only.
So for commission members to recognize this is different from what you had proposed predominantly in the area of, do we go with the 55 and want to go to the 30, or do we do the 10% on the 750?
Yeah.
10% on the 750 might be something to look at in the future. And if we have the opportunity to study, we certainly should, but that's not implementable in 2024. We are now 5 months from an assessment standpoint, 5 months into 2024. They do not have the ability to make that adjustment by August of this year to give reasonable numbers to the taxing jurisdictions. So we could eliminate them altogether. They could give reasonable estimates. We could do the 55 and the 30, they could give reasonable estimates, but they can't implement the 10% on the 750. So just because, you know, I like really wrinkly dogs, but I think that that's important for the commission to keep in mind.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we're getting a very clear picture of the financial reality too of what we're up against here. Because we haven't even talked about where we're going to find hundreds of millions, perhaps 1.5 billion, which I'm pretty sure the couch cushions don't have that much in it. All right, other discussion here. Commissioner Richardson.
Yeah, just quickly, and just working the math and keeping the 55,000 off and applying that assessment rate float back up, it's about a 5.4% increase on the taxable value that our constituents would see. And I think that's within the 6% cap we were generally talking about. So harmless to discuss, but I think when you turn it around and look at it from the taxpayer's point of view, and then our ability as local governments to adjust down further if that seems excessive, I think we're in the right ballpark with keeping what we had with the off the top reduction, because we can either not do that or do that, but we can't do the percentage reduction with the time left. But it's again a reason, not an unreasonable increase year over year with just the bringing up the residential assessment rate from the 6.7 to the.
Yeah, I think you're calculating that as about a 6% change.
Yeah, it's 5.4. It's in that same ballpark we've been talking as a reasonable amount.
Right. Yeah, I did that same calculation myself. All right, other comments on where we are? Commissioner Donis.
Thank you. I'm just curious about how our taxing authorities felt about that Senate Bill 1 backfill calculation or formula. I mean, it was specific to population size, and then it specifically talked about if there was a value change for those districts that was more than a certain percentage, then they got, in some circumstances, 65% backfill, in some circumstances, 0 backfill, sort of capturing all of those pieces about some districts had a large increase in value and some didn't. And so it staggered that backfill. Should we be applying that to figure out what that backfill amount is rather than continuing to talk about $1.5 billion of backfill?
Well, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. I mean, we used that approach because we needed to limit backfill so we could afford it. That was when we had hundreds of millions of dollars of general funds set aside, which we don't anymore. So yeah, I'd love to hear ideas. If folks want to continue down this track, we would need to figure out who's going to get a haircut and who's not, if I can put it in colloquial terms. So I'm happy to entertain thoughts there. I do want to point out that we're at 4:15. Our time will draw to a close here in 45 minutes, as much as I love you all. But I think that's a very fruitful thing to spend a few minutes on if folks have ideas of how we would update that backfill formula, for lack of a better title. Commissioner Terry.
Thank you. If I understood the question, how did local taxing entities think about 001? Well, if you were not a fire district, EMS district, or a health district, you hated it because you didn't get any. So for me, that's off the table. That was very difficult for us to swallow, but it was in a short time frame. And what I would suggest, and well, let me just throw it out there. I'm not sure it works. How's that? 238 had a formula based on growth of the tax of the county and population. So, and I think it was growth of revenue growth or taxable revenue growth, I think. So what if we looked at what those figures are for 2023 or 2020 to apply in 2024. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I guess what I'm saying is update 238 numbers to today's prices and revenue. What does that get us? Only because it is a formula that, while we might not have liked it, we could explain it. I'm not really advocating for it. I'm just wondering if that's a way to do it. But 001 for taxing districts outside in the special district world is a hard no for us. I mean, that was just too difficult.
Yeah, I guess I'll say as the author of both of those bills, yeah, we adjusted to the times. None of those were easy decisions, but 238 was more generous. Absolutely. And if we want to take a fresh look at that, we can. Happy to entertain thoughts on that.
I don't know if that works or not, and Commissioner Groff may be able to.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of a interesting thing, right? We're looking at either trying to figure out how to reduce 1.5 billion or how do we reduce 800 million total, and who gets reduced? I mean, I think the crux of your question. It's the absolute right question. It's just the resource constraints that we're up against here. Commissioner Donis, were you?
Representative.
Was there somebody with their hand up on this end of the table? Thank you. Representative Degree Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this whole conversation just paints a picture of why it's so complicated for the state that's operating under a TABOR cap to be reimbursing a bunch of districts that are not. And it's, and there's no formula of the state that will fairly reimburse the great diversity of different kinds of local districts we're dealing with. So I'm open to these conversations, but I think, 238 is still at least partially in effect for this year. And so in some ways, if like to the previous conversation, if what we're talking about is getting out of the business of the state imposing cuts with these awkward backfill formulas and moving towards a cap where we're saying whatever has happened over the last few years is what it is, but moving forward there will be a cap to make sure you never see a spike like this again. I think in some ways, allowing the partial property tax reductions that are still in effect from Prop 238 in this year might be the least bad option, or maybe we could find some middle ground here. But I just don't see a world where we find, even just the 380 million for K-12. That's what, 2% out of the reserve. I think Senator Hansen knows those numbers better than I do, but that's cutting us down from 15% to 13%, which is a pretty deep cut. The state ed fund is also feeling a lot of strain. So I think the K-12 piece of this alone is really hard. And then on the local gov piece, the state will have nowhere near $1.1 billion that we could backfill. So we're talking about considerable haircuts to the local governments. And I think it just feels like it's too much. And so I think that maybe there could be a middle road where as we've been talking about, but at the end of the day, there's going to come a moment, if we do move into cap rather than cut in the long term, we're going to have a moment where people's property tax bills kind of get caught up again to where the assessment rates were before 238. And so I think it's kind of a question of whether, is it better to happen this year, or for, just to throw this out there, the cap theoretically could be a referred measure. It could be the case that the voters are voting on a cap this November. Is it better or worse if the property tax rates catch back up a year after they pass a cap? It almost seems like that's going to be more confusing and challenging for voters than if we let it kind of start edging back up this year as we move into this new paradigm with a cap.
Commissioner Doherty.
I know I'm not necessarily the person everybody wants to hear from today, but I also think the largest problem in the state of Colorado right now is affordability of housing. And if we don't want to do right by the owners of property in Colorado, then let's not make any changes to move forward. All I'm hearing is all or none. I'm not hearing anybody making any suggestions on who takes the haircut. And we're kind of deadlocked right now. So what I'd like to suggest is that we look out for the people of the state of Colorado and make a decision from there. Thank you.
Mayor Castriota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if I'm the only one that's having a hard time following all of these numbers and scenarios because I'm not really sure if we're looking at additions to the draft bill or we're still taking apart the existing scenarios.
Well,
Is there a way to get a slide made of if we're going to be
well, yeah, we did have that. That was great. And we can throw that back up on the screen. So the kind of sub proposal, I kind of think of it as like the skinny version of this bit of light reading I provided to everybody on Tuesday. We did capture that in kind of a typed up slide, so we can throw that back up on the screen. I think what we've just done though is look at the financial implications of that sub proposal, which are significantly different from the financial implications of some of the concepts that were in the draft bill. And so now we're having, a chance to compare and contrast. And I think getting to, where the rubber meets the road, which is, okay, who gets backfill, who doesn't, who gets relief, who doesn't. I mean, these are the classic legislative questions we deal with. And certainly the mayors and the commissioners and the fire chiefs, you guys know this as well as anybody. It's the same thing happening with maybe a few less zeros, but it's the same exact trade-offs that you struggle with that we're talking about here. But up on the screen, you can see what was thrown out for consideration. And the idea was a cap and then extending everything we're doing now into 24. We've spent the last 45 minutes or so looking at the financial implications of number 3 on this list, along with the idea of ratcheting down on the non-res side. So that's kind of what we've been looking at, and you can see the other pieces of it here on the second screen. So a big thank you to Keystone as always for keeping us on track. But that's where I think we are, and this helps us kind of put into perspective some of the concepts that were in the draft bill that just to share from as someone who was the principal author here, not the sole author, but the principal author, some of the decisions that were made in the draft were trying to go from 1.5 billion down to something that was more manageable with the limited resources we have. So that's why some of those things show up, like we were talking about before, primary homestead versus everybody else. That is a way to drastically change the amount of backfill that you might need. And so that's kind of where some of those decisions come from, is that we knew we were starting from a baseline of let's just continue current law. Okay, now everybody here knows what that means, and seeing if we could chip away at the total fiscal impact. Yep.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Commissioner Richardson.
And if I may, I just urge all of us to look at not when in the backfill discussion, not what could we have potentially collected, but what do we actually need? If we keep the current reductions and let the assessment rate float back up, I know my numbers better than anybody else's. Within our county, the backfill we got from 238 was a little bit above or below 6%. We got nothing out of 001. If we were to get no backfill, but a 5.4 or 6% increase in taxes, it leaves us whole. And I think it's incumbent on every local government and every association that represents the different types of local governments to really look at that. What do we need? That backfill may not, I'm not going to turn away money, but I know how hard it is to find it and what we're competing against. If we don't need backfill, we need to come to the table honestly and say, can we survive on what we're collecting? We shouldn't just be looking to get what we could have gotten, but only collect what we need. So thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments very much. I'm going to go to Commissioner Pogue and then to Rep. Degree Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Commissioner Richardson's comments on backfill. The challenge, I think, or the reason that backfill became important was because it was the exemptions that created a disparity across the state, right? We had counties that actually were exempting so much in relationship to their total property value that they weren't whole, and they were actually losing revenue in a cycle where many counties were increasing their revenue. So I guess I don't know if I'm brave enough to throw out another approach, but I am curious if we let go of the exemptions, but kept the rates, what would that revenue loss look like? Or if we kept the exemption for residential, but let go the exemption for non-res, knowing that we're all committed to a ratchet down in the rates over time, and that if we can put, build that schedule out in a way that local governments can count on planning for it, does that then keep some savings or keep some affordability for our constituents, but add some predictability for local governments?
Representative Degree-Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm so appreciative of what the Commissioners Richardson and Pogue are getting at. And to Commissioner Richardson's point, I think that's exactly right, that it should be kind of an analysis of the need. But the challenge is the state government and the ballot this November are in no position to determine what those needs are. It really is every individual government. And so I think the one thing I would just remind is whatever it is that we don't do in terms of assessment rates at the state level, there is still the option for those local governments to reduce their mill levies. And I think what I've heard time and again in these conversations is, even though there are a number of jurisdictions that have lowered their mill levies, many others have not, because they don't know what the state is going to be doing to their budgets. And so I think that once we kind of have established whatever the stable new paradigm is going to be, there is a world where those mill levies could be lowered. Now, that you may hear a little bit of ignorance in my voice about when exactly those mill levies are certified by those local governments for 2024. I may have already been done, but I do think no? Okay. So I think that's just something worth remembering here, that whatever we don't do, the local governments that can afford to still have the option of lowering mill levies.
Mr. Fagan, please get us back on track.
Yeah, well, I think that there are a lot of commonalities here that might boil down to something like the following. So keeping the residential value adjustment at 55, increasing the assessment rate to 7.06, which would be the recommendation. At the non-res, to stay with the 30,000 of value adjustment, but go up to 29 for the assessment rate. That leaves, if I'm following everything, about $800 million of loss, 600 to local jurisdictions, 200 additional to school finance. Then this discussion about carrying forward 238, looking at the criteria for that, because that formula may not actually require $800 million, if at least 600 million, let's say that, setting school finance aside. So determining if the 238 formula or a modification of that were used, what would be the actual need for backfill? That's still going to be a number. It's still going to be a big number. And perhaps at that point, what's in the draft bill about spending from the reserve for, say, 24, we're just talking about 24 now, that might be a way to offset the revenue loss without having to readjust appropriations. Might be a way to try to resolve, get something forward. It seems to me that that approach is sort of everyone is sharing in something there, right? Because assessment rates are going to go up. The state is going to have to pay some more, assuming there's some backfill. But to the extent that revenues will increase to local jurisdictions, they have the ability to reduce mill levies. And if that could be protected with a temporary reduction that has been in the bill language, then it seems like that balances out a lot of different things. So it would be certainty for at least the next year. Everybody would have to share in that because maybe not all the backfill would be filled. And for those jurisdictions that would, by setting the assessment rates up, would have revenue increases, local governments could take care of that by reducing their mills. Does that work kind of as a paradigm framework?
If that sounded beyond a Rubik's Cube. I guess, Mr. Fagan, I was trying to keep up with you as you were going through each of the points. I think it's just hard for at this stage in the afternoon to remember each of the parts that you were talking about.
Just trying to summarize really what the commission talked about to a way to get to some kind of where do we go from here for today?
Well, yeah, that is the what turns out to be the multi-billion-dollar question. So I mean, I think after today, we're not planning any more formal meetings of this commission between now and the end of the session. But we're all in the same boat together called Colorado. So let me come down to Commissioner Capelli for his thoughts.
Just a really simple request. I know that was a lot, it would be hard to summarize, but if you could write that up and put it up, then we could analyze it. I also did not follow all of it.
Yeah, and obviously we transition from today into early next week with what legislative proposal do we want to move forward with and introduce. This is crunch time. I think we can all walk away today realizing there aren't exactly a bunch of great options. If I can have that summary. We are choosing between the least bad. Commissioner Groff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spirit of trying to reach cooperation and get us to our cars before the total downpour that's happening outside, if you listen to the that thunder, thank you, that was rather timely. Can we perhaps separate component parts of this out and vote on them without the penalty of it's already a decided decision? To just get so sometimes you'll allow for amendments to be voted on. We're not really following legislative rules. So I'd like to do a straw poll on 55, on the 55,000, then on the 30,000, then on the interest rates, then on the backfill, and kind of do them individually, recognizing that at some point we're going to need to do a total package, but I think that that'll give us a better direction. Do we want the 55,000 or do we want the 10? Do we want the 10% 750? Do we want the 30,000 or do we want to make a 27.9? Hold the commercial rate to 27.9. I mean, there are a lot of. I'm talking that Rubik's Cube, which to you is easy, but to me is hard. But I think if we could know the direction of the commission, we might be able to reach a conclusion that would be more satisfactory. That's a number one. And then number two, I think that you could look to a third mechanism for backfill based on 238 backfill, but perhaps do different percentages. Could still work within that framework that gave more to more districts, but also you maybe instead of going to 65%, you go to 30% for districts over a certain size, or for counties over a certain size. I mean, I think there's a lot of flexibility within the 238 backfill to use that mechanism, but have it be different percentages.
I don't know if it helps to clarify, but all that was based on 2022 assessed value growth.
It was. So I think it'd be pretty easy to calculate is what I'm saying. I don't think we'd have to wait till we get tax bills in December to be able to calculate it.
So what I hear you saying is you'd like to take a straw poll, I think if I heard you right, on 4 to 6 elements that we've been discussing.
Yes.
Am I hearing that right? And the elements that I heard you talk about were the 55, the 30, the RAR change, the non-res change, or commercial rate change, because obviously we're not talking about oil and gas, et cetera, and the 238 formula.
Or a backfill concept.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I might ask for Keystone's help here. I don't mind a straw poll at all, as long as people kind of realize, right, at the end of the day, it's all got to gel into a cohesive legislative proposal. But I think I like the suggestion of kind of just take the temperature of the room on which of these elements do you like or not like. Is that what you're looking for, Commissioner Groff?
Yes, that would be great.
All right, and I see Commissioner Davis has his hand up.
My only problem with this approach is that it feels like we're voting on which leg of the table to take out and which ones we like, because I kind of like the package as proposed as a whole with the 6% cap, the 29%, 30K. It seems like a fair compromise. It's not as far as of a reduction as last year's, but it's still a reduction with a reasonable cap. But if we're just voting on a 6% cap, or we're just voting on a $55,000 reduction, it's not tied to anything. It makes it hard for me just to single them out and vote on one single component, like a leg on the table. So that's my only concern, and I'd rather vote on them as a package.
And Commissioner Davis, do you have any thoughts on how to handle backfill with this proposal?
I'm right there with Commissioner Pogue and Richardson. I think there's going to have to be some share from local governments. It's not as though government's going to have to write a check back to the taxpayers this year. It's just uncollected tax revenue, not to the degree that they would have had if the 6% was not in place. So I think there's going to have to be some burden sharing on this as well. And then over time, as Commissioner Richardson said, that 6% will hopefully grow back into that. So, but I'm sorry. Anyways, that's my thoughts. So if you need more clarification, let me know.
And are you in favor of the cap applying to local and schools, or only to local? Because I think that was one of the other divisions that, or separations that we talked about earlier.
I don't know. I mean, I know it's a big cap for the school district, which again doesn't bear much on the school district locally, because they're made whole either way. That's more of a question for the state on what they can manage. So I don't know that I can answer that question. I'm a little undecided.
Yep, appreciate it. Commissioner Vick.
So I have a little trepidation about voting on some of these measures.
It should be clear we're not voting. Sorry to cut you off. Like, this is not a vote.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of a straw poll.
It's a metrometer.
Mentimeter situation.
Just putting forth a position, put it that way, without having a further understanding of what possible mechanisms we might be using to fill the reductions that we're talking about. Because obviously, from the education perspective, we have been supporting the rest of the state budget for well over 10 years now. And we fortunately just got rid of the mechanism that did that. And so, without an understanding of how the overall state budget would absorb a reduction in this area, whether it's backfill or whether it's these overall rate cuts or things like that, it would be difficult for me to really assess how to manage this. I mean, obviously, any reduction, I would want to see any reductions minimized as much as possible, or offset by projections and growth as much as possible. But I think this is not taking place in a vacuum, and traditionally, where shortfalls have landed has been in a cut to education. And so I would just want to make sure that we are still safeguarding that as much as possible. I'd hate to be right back into a situation where the state is instituting a budget stabilization factor again.
Yeah, I think there's broad agreement on that. Thank you, Commissioner Vick. Commissioner Groff.
So I know we're getting close to the end of our day and that tempers are frayed and we'd all like more time. There are 12 days left in the legislative session. We have no valuation plan for 2024, and we are 4 months into 2024. We have got to figure out what we're going to do in 2024. Everything else we can push off into studying it more this summer. However, if this commission doesn't put out something a little bit better than just a solution to 2024, we can be pretty well guaranteed that one of those ballot initiatives is going to pass. So I would love to see us do, and I was just trying to get us off of just focusing on what the reductions were going to be for 24. I'm ready to vote on what Ms. Furman proposed to begin with, which didn't actually address the backfill issue, but the 6% hard cap, the decoupling study, the extension of the residential reduction for 2024. If we don't want to get into these details, we can just talk about that. But again, we have to have a selection for 2024 that comes out of this legislative session. There's no way we can't. It would be really helpful if we could have some idea from the commission what direction we would like to go going into the future, or we are giving no ammunition to people to oppose the more draconian ballot initiatives that we're going to see. So for what that's worth.
I think the commission has made their feelings clear on the ballot initiatives. I think we did a nice job of getting through all of them. So thank you for that, Commissioner Groff.
So I put together a Mentimeter because I do think that would be helpful.
So I'm hearing, I just was checking in with staff.
Yeah.
And it sounds like we're fine to do like, hey, who likes this thing?
Yeah. This would just be the temperature.
Right. I don't know if Ms. Rudebush wants to join us for a second. We're just trying to make sure we are following kind of open meeting law issues here and transparency. And I would love to hear Ms. Rudebush's comments on how we might proceed here, just to take a sense of the room.
Katie Rudebush, Legislative Council staff. I think since we are talking about a piece of legislation, it cannot be anonymous. So a Mentimeter poll is anonymous. So we are fine with you raising your hands because then we know who raised their hand for what. So if you're not going to take a full roll call vote, a non-anonymous form of taking the temperature is fine.
So I just quickly, I'm comfortable if we want to kind of get a sense of the room on some of these big issues we've been grappling with. But I guess we're responding to a draft concept as opposed to an introduced bill. Does that make any difference here? Ms. Rudebush.
I would say to be safe, just to make sure where everyone stands on every issue, that we should be transparent. And because it's involving a draft that may become legislation, I would recommend that it's not anonymous.
So you're saying we need to do roll call situation, or we can get a sense of the room by doing hands raised, more division style, I guess?
It's more division style.
Okay.
I guess I would say in past interim committees, when we've narrowed down bills, some committees take the approach of raising hands before they take a poll before they take a vote. So it's not uncommon.
Understood. Okay. Thanks everybody for letting us just check in on that. Thanks, Ms. Rudebush, for always making sure we don't go off the rails.
We could I could show this on the screen and we could do the raise your hand
So we've got, I think, five concepts. Is that what you've got captured?
That's what I have captured, and let's do these 5, and then if we feel like we're missing something, we can add up.
Okay, yeah, let's take a quick look at it.
Okay.
This is probably the last thing we're going to do here today, and see if folks are comfortable with these 5 to kind of get a sense from the room, which will certainly be useful for legislative members as we continue this process. So I'm glad we can take a look at this. All right, I'm seeing residential 55 reduction 706, and then same concept on non-res, and then going to the 29. And then should we crib off of 238 backfill as our approach? And then I see the 6% cap on local only. I'm seeing that captured. And then what's the next part?
For taxing jurisdictions with a revenue base increases, they have the option to lower the taxes by reducing the mills.
Right, that's table stakes. There were a very small number of.
Listen, y'all, this was created 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Everybody go easy.
It was created as a part of a package, right? That was a recognition that.
Yeah.
Quick question of point of clarification.
Yes, please go ahead, Commissioner Terry.
Point of clarification, the first three are for 2024, and then the last, at least two that I can see are going forward into the future. So I think we need to discern those two things, what we want for 2024, and then what we recommend going forward. And it's 6% growth with the exceptions, if you will, or that we outlined. But those look like two different ones this year, ones.
Yeah, so I did have those caveats, which is new construction and growth, oil and gas. There's prior voter approval to go over caps. You're saying with all those caveats,
yep.
Do we want to apply a 6% cap annually for local jurisdictions? So I think we're evaluating local here only is what I'm seeing. Is that everyone good with that as the thing on the board? Yes. Yeah, please go ahead, Representative.
Mike. His microphone's on. Your mic is on.
So adding on to that would be that the residential rate would be fixed at something. But still, there was discussion about ratcheting the non-res commercial down. So should we put all those on one line in that for the 6%?
I think really the residential is the key question. I have not really heard an alternative to the non-res piece. I think that's something, I mean, we can talk about specific variables here, but I think that's more of a moving bills through committees process conversation than it is about the conversation here. I think this is more of a high level cap or cut when it comes to residential.
Commissioner Richardson.
And just on the 238, I think my understanding of the discussion was we would use that framework, not necessarily the specific formula. So we
that's right. Yeah, I'm thinking
look out for those that were
update it for 2024
not
kind of idea.
So we can kind of keep the hold harmless.
Yeah,
not take people negative. But thanks.
Yep. All right. So sorry, it's a little hard to see those from here.
Sorry, I'm trying to edit them real quick.
Yeah, it's all right. I do want to say on the Senate Bill 238, of course, that was the more generous version of backfill. Of course, that would mean, more financial obligation from the state if we go down that direction. So just so everybody knows that is the case. If you like that framework. All right, we'll give Keystone Team.
Mr. Chair, I think.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Completeness, the word cap should be in that 6%. It just says 6% growth. We're talking about a growth cap. So
yeah, and that's annual, just to keep that in mind.
Yeah,
so over a cycle that would.
You're tweaking.
I guess over a 2-year cycle, it would compound. So it's 12 point something. Just keep that in mind. Chief Holme.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess maybe I'm a little whizzed up here. Why have we been debating all this reduction and the 55,000 value reduction, the assessment rate? Why don't we just go to the cap? The estimates are is that property taxes or values are going to rise by 7%, not 29%. So why don't we go to the cap, eliminating all the rest of that, and then there's no backfill?
Well, that is certainly an option in front of us here this evening. So you can vote no on, or not support, or not add your voice vote for everything but that one. That is absolutely an option for you and for all of us.
Another point of clarification.
Yes.
Commissioner Olney, the 6% is going forward though, not with no backfill.
Right.
That's the formula to go forward with. The framework, the 238 is we've got to do something because as Commissioner Groff said, we're up against a brick wall for 2024.
And I appreciate that. My intent would be to move forward with the cap for the next, as soon as we could. I don't know if that works in a timeline. Get rid of all the exemptions. The estimate is that property values are rising at 7%, not 29%.
What I'm hearing from the assessors is since we're in the middle of a cycle, that would be a no-go, almost impossible. Just because we're in the middle of a cycle.
I'll have our assessor chime in on that.
Commissioner Terry, maybe I'm not following what you're saying, but the cap doesn't affect the actual value or the assessed value. So we would be talking about applying a cap for 2025, basically, letting the value calculate based on whatever we establish for 2024. So I'm sure I'm missing something and you can clarify.
And so am I probably, so, yeah, but my thoughts.
Well, what I think I heard Commissioner Olney say was that he was thinking we could have a 6% revenue cap that's effective immediately rather than, which we can say using Senate Bill 1, it said if you have less than a 15% value change, you're not going to get any backfill. And so this would be like saying less than 12% if we were looking at 2 years. So I think there's just confusion still to the entire conversation. But Commissioner Terry, perhaps I didn't understand what you said.
Yeah, this is an important point here. I mean, I think the idea here is starting with 238 framework and seeing if we can adjust it to the current conditions to allow for what you just referenced. Let's take a couple other comments and then we're going to need to take the sense of the room. So I'm going to go Mayor Castriota and then down in front of me to Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you, Mr.
Capelli's
Chair.
had his hand up for a while. Sorry, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just go this way across the room.
That's okay.
Yep,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Please go ahead, Mayor.
Real quick, we're already, deep into 2024 and a lot of the funds have been allocated and committed and encumbered. So I don't think we should be capping anything in the current fiscal year that we're in. Yeah, and then moving forward, we're already 5 months into our 2025 budget process as well. I'm sure most counties aren't waiting to the last minute. We start in February for the next year. So I think we need to be really mindful of that and how our budget cycles work. And I really think we should do what we have to do, as Commissioner Groff said, to get 2024 settled first. That is a priority. We have a lot of things hanging in the wings. So maybe we focus on that first and then decide what to do with the rest.
Let's go Commissioner Johnson and then to Commissioner Capelli.
I just wanted to repeat something I said earlier in terms of the cap. I appreciate that this doesn't necessarily apply as proposed on the K-12 side, but the nature of property tax revenue kind of looks like alligator teeth, where you kind of get a growth, your growth is in the assessment years. And that's why I was talking about maybe you have a 12% every other year cap based on the assessment year, because my guess is you would never hit the cap in the non-assessment year, and you would almost in most of the time hit the cap in the assessment year. And so I guess I'm just suggesting a nuance in terms of when you kind of make that cap apply is what I wanted to reiterate.
Commissioner Capelli.
I just want to make the comment that I think the largest issue for folks who have higher cost homes, with the exception of people who are lower income in higher cost homes, which happens in rural resort districts, it's the change is the biggest issue, and so an argument that we don't need the exemption or value reduction because we're not expecting a massive change makes sense. But for lower income people, fixed income people, not all of whom are seniors, the number itself is getting high. I realize it's not high compared to other states, but I do feel like that's the value of the exemption. I've been told that there's statutory reasons why when about a state doesn't work, but I just really wish that there was a way to taper down from 55K after a certain value point. I mean, right now, the model that Senator Hansen you put forward tapers up and then goes down again. And then stays flat. If there was a way to go up to save rural jurisdictions, just like you said, and then go down again on the other side, so you're not giving large breaks to high cost homes, I imagine that would be a really great savings. But apparently that's against the Constitution. So that's my comment.
All right. I think we should probably move forward with this final straw poll. Great discussion today. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'm not sure we've solved all the world's problems. In fact, I'm sure we haven't, but we've got a little bit more clarity on the options in front of us legislatively that we can look at over the next couple of weeks. So let me ask Keystone how you'd like us to do this. Is this a raise hands, stand up, sit down, fight? What works best?
Stand up, sit down, fight.
Yeah, that's
for
what
sure.
I thought.
Yeah, I think hands is fine. You get one hand, and you do need to raise it.
That's right.
All right.
No
So-
abstentions.
No abstentions here. We can do it. All right. So we'll just go through these 5, and we'll keep it on the record per Katie. Thank you, Katie. Keeping us in line. All right. So starting with residential 50K value reduction. Again, you're raising your hand in support, and then we'll do a raising hand not in support. Okay. So residential 55K value reduction, 7.06% assessment rate for 2024. Raising hand in support. One hand, Miss Terry. Okay. All right, hands down. Oh, sorry, online folks. I see Commissioner Pogue, your hand up. Commissioner Davis, can you let me, okay. All right, so for those opposing 2024 residential 55K value reduction, 7.06% assessment rate, please raise your hand. Commissioner Davis, okay. All right, thank you. Moving on, again, 2024, non-residential 30K value reduction, 29% assessment rate. In support, one hand, go ahead and raise it. Keep it up, we're capturing. All right, go ahead and lower your hand. And if you oppose non-residential 30K value reduction, please raise your hand.
Second half of that is 29%.
Tamara, can you just clarify that you're opposed?
That's correct. I'm opposed.
Okay, all right, just want to make sure. Okay. All right, moving on. Also 2024 Senate Bill 238 framework for backfill. In support, raise your hand. Perfect. All right, go ahead and lower those. If you are opposed, SB 238 framework for backfill, raise your hand. Is that a hand, Lauren? Okay. Okay, Vic and Hansen, okay. All right, moving forward. So this is for going forward, a 6% annual growth cap on local taxing jurisdiction tax revenue with exceptions TBD. Correct, going forward. Beyond 2024. Raising your hand. You're in support. Seeing both online. Except for Gavin. All right, go ahead and lower. And oppose the 6% going forward. Raise your hand. Okay, go ahead, lower. All right, and last one, again, going forward beyond 2024 for taxing jurisdictions where the revenue base increases, they have the option to lower the taxes by reducing the mills. They already have it. Yeah, this was the mistake. Okay, just for fun, right? No,
Everybody, yeah. Yeah.
We're gonna keep going. Yep. All right.
Have the power.
There you go, Senator Hansen.
Woo! Big finish, everybody.
Senator Hansen?
Commissioner Groff.
In your bill, and I think as
Our
part of
bill.
this committee, we also have, we didn't vote on it now, but we've also endorsed the ratcheting down of the
Yes.
commercial rate. I don't think we need to take a vote.
Yeah,
on
I think
that. We already-
we're clearly on record on that piece. Yeah, thank you for the reminder. All right, everyone. Well, so ends one part of our work and begins the next chapter. Final comments. Make them quick.
Thank you,
Mayor
Mr.
Castriota.
Chair. What about a special session?
We'll be holding that in City Hall, Broomfield. Commissioner Doherty.
Real
All right.
quick, because I'm not completely clear, what will be coming forward in this draft bill next week?
Well, that makes two of us. So I'm going to do my best to work through each of the recommendations that we just looked at
And the ones
and
from
continue the
earlier
conversation with everybody in this room and about 600 others.
Okay.
And that will look a lot like the normal legislative process.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
You all have my cell phone number. You know how to reach myself, Senator Baisley, Representative Frizzell, Representative Degree Kennedy. And we hope to hear from you often, preferably before midnight on a given day. I've just gotten a good reminder from the vice chair. Let me actually just turn it to you for a quick comment.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Because of the big numbers and different formulas and how they might impact each other, and it seems your fiscal staff has a fairly good sense of that, at least statewide, but our county and I imagine other districts and entities staff do not. I'm asking if we can have a little bit of leeway for a limited number, and I'm saying limited number of our fiscal staff to have conversations with them so that we can figure out potential local fiscal impacts in the compressed time frame that we have.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to obligate LCS to anything further, but I would say the short answer is yes. We're going to try to be able to get people as much information on the fiscal impacts as we go. I'll certainly, be sharing that as widely as I can. Well, obviously, we'll have a very public process once we get to a official fiscal note. But I think what you're describing makes a lot of sense, and I maybe would just ask folks to funnel those questions through myself and the vice chair, and we'll turn them around quickly. It's probably a good way to handle that. Does that sound all right to everyone? All right. Well, let me draw to a close our in-session sessions and say a huge thank you to the hard work, the careful thought, the creativity that you have all brought to this important conversation. We enter an equally difficult phase over the next couple of weeks, but one that I know you'll all stay heavily engaged in and be helping us do our jobs the best we possibly can between now and CNADA. And if everyone would join me in thanking the team from Keystone. Really wonderful, wonderful job. Yeah, that's right. And we'll have a separate round of applause, if you would, for Greg, Dave, and Pierce. of course, you can see their half smiles because they are less than halfway through this work. A big thank you to everyone. Please be safe on your way home, and I look forward to seeing everybody at the Capitol over the next couple of weeks. We are adjourned.